The story begins when the goddess transforms a person's soul into a spore. And they say that humanity's #1 killer throughout history is something called a virus. The goddess found it strange and interesting that someone would wish to become a virus, so she granted his wish by transforming him into one. Then, the goddess released the spores into a deep forest. The spores landed on the nose of a mouse, and it seeped inside. It invades the cell nucleus and begins to replicate the mutated cells. Eventually, the spores take over the entire body. The infected mouse gradually regained consciousness, felt a slight headache, and wondered why it was outdoors. It also realized that its vision was now very strange and distorted. Then the person now living in the body of a mouse saw a puddle of water and gazed intently at their reflection. He was shocked to realize he had turned into a rat. In his confusion and panic, he wondered what was happening and why he was in this state, because he clearly remembered being at work just minutes before. Suddenly, a tree root snapped out of the ground. He lunged towards a 3-legged bird. Terrified, he immediately hid behind a tree and watched as the tree completely swallowed the bird. Seeing that bizarre sight, the person controlling the mouse's body suddenly realized a harsh truth. He was in another world. Memories began to return. He remembered working at a pharmaceutical company and often staying late after everyone else had gone home to do his own research in the lab. From that point onward, he remembered nothing, leading him to conclude that something terrible must have happened during the experiment, most likely resulting in his death. Then he found himself floating in a pure white space, where a woman claiming to be a goddess appeared. She spun a strange, fateful wheel and announced that in his next life he would become a virus. Recalling that incident, the person now inhabiting the body of a mouse suddenly realized that he hadn't been reincarnated as a mouse, but as a virus controlling the mouse's body. Although he's a researcher and finds it absurd to believe in a goddess, given the current circumstances, it seems he really has been reincarnated. He found the situation ironic and viewed it as karma, that he had been reborn as a mouse, the very animal he had experimented on many times. Accepting his new reality, he decided to explore what he could do and began thinking about his next step. At that moment, he noticed red particles flying out of his mouth and was surprised to find that he could see the virus with the naked eye. He soon realized those particles were a part of himself. He wondered if he could control the mouse's perspective as a virus. To test that, he began to focus intensely on the particles existing inside the mouse's body, and he succeeded in transforming the perspective into the shape of a virus. Now, in the form of a virus, he observes his surroundings and realizes he is inside capillaries. Knowing it would be dangerous if he were detected by the white blood cells, he decided to leave the area. Finally, he approached a cell wall and intended to use it, but at that moment he noticed something unusual. A small tumor was slowly forming on the cell membrane. Surprisingly, the tumor transformed into an exact replica of the virus's current form. As more copies continued to emerge from the cell membrane, he was both astonished and horrified. Putting that feeling aside, he approached another virus cell and asked if it could speak. However, that virus cell showed no reaction, leading him to conclude that he was the only virus with willpower. Because he was the only virus with a will, he began to wonder if his role was to command this massive army of viruses. Despite not knowing how, he decided to try and ordered a nearby virus cell to follow him. Immediately, all the viruses gathered around him, responding to his command. This stunned him because he hadn't expected them to gather so quickly. When all the virus cells were obeying him, he realized he could control them remotely to a certain extent. However, he knew more testing was needed and decided to put that aside for later. He was still struggling to adjust to his new reality. Becoming a virus with consciousness and the ability to think collectively was completely beyond his imagination. Even for someone who had been a researcher like him, he found his new abilities in the form of a virus difficult to comprehend. Suddenly, a voice echoed in his head, announcing his current characteristics, the ability to infect, control, and replicate. Initially, he panicked and wondered whose voice it was. He then began to wonder if the aforementioned characteristics were indeed his abilities, since he had clearly infected a mouse, consistent with the infectious characteristic, and had replicated himself within its body, corresponding to the replication characteristic. The remaining ability was control, which he used to take control of the mouse's body. Since there were no rules requiring him to only possess mice, he decided he would soon find a new host with a more powerful life force. At that moment, the system, acting as a narrator, announced that because he had successfully infected the forest rat, he had acquired new abilities: cowardice, danger detection, and agility. As a former researcher, he quickly realized that traits like timidity, danger detection, and agility were actually abilities of rats. And once they are recorded into his RNA sequence, it means he has replicated the host's ability simply by infecting it. Realizing that he could copy the abilities of any creature he infected, he chuckled gleefully at the bizarre situation and eagerly began searching for a new host. As a former researcher, he had never witnessed a creature evolve so rapidly in modern times. Depending on how he uses this new ability, he could even become the most dangerous creature in history. While searching for the next host to verify the information from the system, he stopped beside a flower and wondered if his abilities had any impact on plants. So he decided to give it a try, releasing the virus particles towards the flower. Surprisingly, he succeeded in infecting the plant and immediately acquired two new conditions: fever reduction and pain relief. This confirmed that his abilities also worked on plants. As he was contemplating how helpful the two conditions, fever reduction and pain relief would be, a strong gust of wind blew through, carrying the virus particles in a different direction. Those particles landed on the bizarre plant he had seen devour the three-legged bird earlier. Since the monster tree had been exposed to virus particles, he was curious to know what ability he would receive this time. However, the system didn't provide any notification. He moved closer to observe more carefully and began to suspect that perhaps his infectious ability wasn't strong enough to immediately receive a new skill after acquiring one. As he was about to study the monster plant further, it suddenly snapped its mouth shut with tremendous crushing force. Fortunately, he reacted quickly, jumping back and narrowly escaping the deadly bite. That near-death experience terrified him, and he realized that at this moment he was still just a small, weak mouse. He was absolutely certain that he possessed enormous potential as a virus. He recalled that viruses like smallpox had spread across the Earth more than 10,000 years ago. However, in this new world, he might be the source of all viruses, a thought that astonished him. Moreover, he couldn't help but find it ironic that a man who had once created medicine to fight viruses was now reborn as the very thing he had once fought against. For someone who had begun to grow weary of his previous life, this was perhaps the perfect turning point. As a virus, he believed that if he continued to increase his power, he could become the dominant force in this world, perhaps even causing a pandemic to control humanity. However, he wasn't sure if humans actually existed in this world, and began to wonder if he should immediately set off to find them. But suddenly his body trembled violently as the danger detection condition was triggered. He quickly looked around and noticed drops of water falling from above. When he looked up, he saw a wolf standing right behind him. Its eyes were fixed on him, saliva dripping from the side of a delicious-looking rat. Terrified, he tried to run away, but at that moment his cowardly instinct kicked in, paralyzing his body completely. In utter panic, he desperately tried to move, trembling and wondering why those conditions had come into play at such a critical moment. Helpless, he could only watch in horror as the wolf slowly approached and devoured the rat in a single gulp. In that moment, he believed that his life as a virus had truly come to an end. At the same time, the goddess was watching the entire scene unfold. She called him the one who chose to become a virus. Then she adjusted her tone, calling him the one chosen by the virus. The scene shifts to a research institute at night, where working hours have ended and the last two researchers are leaving the laboratory. They notice that one person was still there conducting an experiment. One of them, out of curiosity, asked the other what that person was doing in the lab at that hour. The other person replied that the man said he was researching a new strain of virus. Finding it strange that someone would be working alone so late at night, she wondered if that was really okay. The other man replied that he wasn't sure either, but it was better to leave things alone because the other person was very poor at communicating and nobody knew what he was thinking, so it was better to avoid getting involved. That isolated man is our protagonist, who is now reliving those memories and wishing he wouldn't have to relive those unpleasant moments again. Now, reborn, he wonders what he's doing, then suddenly remembers. He had been devoured by a wolf along with its host. That thought infuriated him, because just as he had been reborn as something interesting, a virus, he lost his life again. But what's done is done and can't be changed. Even so, the thought of being reborn as a human and continuing to live a monotonous life, day after day, was unbearable for him. Although he desperately wanted to continue living as a virus, it seems that his time is coming to an inevitable end. However, he was absolutely not going to let things end like that. Immediately, he activated the infectious characteristic and ordered all the virus cells to use their capillaries to spread throughout the wolf's body. They would take over it. At the same time, he activated the replication ability and directed the virus cells to use the wolf's blood cells to continue replicating. In this way, he intended to increase the number of viruses inside the wolf's body, making it easier to control. At that moment, the wolf began to react. The virus cells had infected deeply enough to take effect. With this step complete, it was time to execute the next part of the plan. He activated the control ability and concentrated all the virus cells together at once. The system then announced that he had acquired the following conditions: enhanced sense of smell, stamina, and aggression. As his vision gradually returned, he realized his field of vision was now much higher than before, and he could taste the blood in his mouth, a strange yet satisfying flavor. The reason he could sense all of that was very clear. He had successfully taken over the wolf's body. He was overjoyed that the plan had succeeded because initially he hadn't expected to be able to control it so easily. But putting aside that astonishment, this was a huge discovery. This event demonstrates that even if the host is killed, as long as he can infect another organism, he will not die, essentially making him immortal. This situation excited him immensely, and he immediately started running to find a new creature to experiment on. After running for a while, he still hadn't encountered any other creatures, even though he could smell them around here. It seemed no one dared approach him, and that made sense, because wolves are very high in the food chain, and he was now radiating a powerful aura far exceeding that of his days as a weak little rat. However, he gradually began to feel bored. Living in the body of a creature he was so familiar with from his previous life was no longer interesting. Despite the slight differences in appearance, it was, after all, still just a wolf. He thought how much more interesting it would be if this world had special creatures, like dragons or goblins from the fantasy stories he used to read. At that moment, he suddenly noticed small figures that looked almost human-like. Curious, he approached to take a closer look and was stunned to realize they were goblins. Their appearance surprised him greatly. Could this be real? They looked almost exactly like the goblins in fantasy novels, only slightly smaller in size. This new discovery led him to begin wondering if this world resembled the fantastical worlds he had read about in his previous life. In any case, goblins are living creatures, and even though he'd never seen them in real life, he was certain he could infect them. With that in mind, he immediately planned his infection and charged at them. But then he suddenly stopped when he heard someone shout, complaining about how persistent these goblins were. Hearing that, he froze, wondering if what he was thinking was true. So he decided to move closer to confirm, and he saw a girl holding a sword, tears glistening in her eyes as she declared firmly that, despite her own weaknesses, she was an adventurer and could not afford to be defeated here. This came as a huge surprise to the virus because he was certain the girl was human, and he never expected to find one so quickly. Suddenly, a goblin lunged forward to attack, and she barely managed to block it with her sword. While the girl fought the goblins, the virus silently observed and analyzed the situation. Based on her appearance and clothing, he concluded that the level of civilization in this world was significantly different from that of Earth. But putting that aside, the girl looked utterly exhausted. She was wearing light armor and wielding a worn-out sword, while the goblins still had plenty of energy. This situation was ideal, he thought. A human body was necessary right now, especially since he had confirmed that humankind actually existed in this world. He realized that he could exploit people to gather information and conduct research. His original plan was to infect the goblins first to acquire their characteristic traits, and then infect the girl and take over her body. Not only that, he also wanted to try something he had long dreamed of, combining the agility he gained from rats with the ferocity he acquired from wolves. In doing so, he successfully imbued the wolf's body with the agility of a rat, significantly increasing its speed. With his body now so evolved, he immediately charged towards the goblins. As he moved, he noticed his body was significantly lighter, and the feeling of nervousness before battle had diminished considerably, most likely an effect of the ferocity condition. Meanwhile, the girl was completely exhausted and could no longer hold out. Just as the goblin's deadly blows were about to land, the wolf lunged forward, grabbed a goblin, and infected it. As a result, the virus acquired a new trait from the goblin, a hot temper. After finishing off the goblin, the wolf dropped its carcass from its mouth, and because he could sense smells through his wolf body, he found the goblin's taste utterly repulsive. Meanwhile, the girl was terrified to see a huge gray wolf standing right in front of her. Witnessing its kin being killed, the remaining goblin became enraged, howled, and lunged to attack the wolf. But he didn't expect the wolf to easily dodge, then immediately close in from behind. He felt exhilarated at being able to move so nimbly with his light body, completely different from his previous life as a 30-year-old researcher. Taking advantage of the goblin's momentary lapse of attention, he struck decisively, knocking it down in the blink of an eye and gaining a new ability: night vision. At this point, the girl also began to realize that this was no ordinary gray wolf. The last goblin, having witnessed the entire horrific scene, was so terrified that it fled. The wolf noticed this, but instead of chasing her, because it didn't want to give the girl a chance to escape, it didn't want to give her a chance to escape. He used his infection skill on the fleeing goblin and gained the dexterity stat. Having dealt with everything else, he turned his attention to the girl, slowly approaching her. After getting close enough, he analyzed the girl's condition and realized that although she was exhausted, she didn't seem to be seriously injured, making her an ideal candidate for his plan. However, he decided to restrain himself and think carefully, as there was still much he didn't know about this new world. In the worst-case scenario, if this world had developed a cure to fight his kind, he worried that he would be discovered and instantly eliminated if he infected humans. Therefore, he decided not to do anything too remarkable until he had a better understanding of this world. However, he still felt incredibly conflicted, because while the human body would be ideal for gathering information, taking it over could also put his life at risk. Confused by the wolf's strange behavior, the girl asked if it intended to eat her. Instinctively, he tried to tell her to wait a moment because he was still thinking, but being in the wolf's body, he couldn't speak. The girl was surprised and misunderstood the barking as a sign that the wolf had no ill intentions and had come to save her. Overwhelmed with emotion, she hugged the wolf and thanked it for saving her. The wolf was startled by the sudden hug and quickly jumped back. The girl tried to reassure him by telling him not to be afraid and to come closer to her. Seeing her acting so carelessly, he didn't understand what was happening and wondered who this innocent creature was. She thanked the wolf again for saving her and called him Mr. Wolf. Then she started rambling, explaining that she had actually tried to avoid the goblins beforehand, but thought she could handle them because she had just read a book on swordsmanship. However, things turned out to be much more difficult than she imagined, and suddenly more goblins appeared out of nowhere. This made her wonder if skilled fighters simply believed they would succeed when cornered. Putting that aside, she said she had learned a lot from witnessing his battle with the goblins. She wondered if living in the wild must be incredibly dangerous for a wolf like him, and that he must have trained every day to be so strong. She explained that she didn't want to take the risk, but had no other choice because she needed to earn money to eat good meals, something he would probably never experience living in the jungle. She quickly added that she didn't mean to say the wolf food was bad, although that might have been true for humans. Listening to her incessant chatter, the wolf wondered how long the girl intended to talk to an animal, and found her behavior perplexing. He also wondered if all people in the world were like this. Putting that aside, he hoped to glean some information about this world from her, but she kept rambling on about irrelevant things, making him yawn with boredom. Seeing his reaction, the girl quickly apologized for getting too carried away talking about her own story while talking to him. Then she decided to reintroduce herself. She introduced herself as Elena, an adventurer, and thanked him once again for saving her life. Finally, he got some useful information when she introduced herself as an adventurer, a profession he recognized from the fantasy novels he had read in his previous life. He remembered that it was a job where people earned rewards by killing monsters and gathering herbs. Because it was such a dangerous job, he wondered why a teenage girl like her would do it alone. Elena explained that she had only been an adventurer for 2 weeks, and during that time she had realized she had absolutely no talent in this field. Therefore, she struggled even when facing lower-level creatures like goblins. Wolf realized he was wrong to think there were no more challenges, as the goblins turned out to be the lowest-level creatures, and even she couldn't defeat them, which meant she was truly very weak. Elena went on to explain that because she was so weak, no one in the Adventurers Guild wanted to team up with her, forcing her to take on missions alone. Hearing this, Wolf smirked maliciously, thinking that if the girl wanted to become stronger, it would be an interesting experiment if he could enhance her power with his virus. At that moment, Elena reached out and gently kissed his nose, saying that he was her first companion on her adventurous journey, and that it had been a long time since she had talked to someone like this, which made her very happy. Before she could say anything more, the wolf immediately jumped back, falling backward in shock at her close proximity. If this were Earth, he would surely be in serious trouble or accused of something grave. Although still surprised by her carefree nature, Elena realized it was starting to get dark. She apologized to the wolf, saying she had to return to town because it was too dangerous here at night. And although she regretted having to leave so early, she had no choice. Hearing this, Wolf began walking beside her, deciding to escort her back to town because finding out where she lived was his top priority. Elena was delighted to realize that Wolf was with her, and she complimented him on being a gentleman, which made him feel a little embarrassed. As they headed toward town, Elena continued to recount how, before becoming an adventurer, she used to work in the fields of the village. It was a small village where everyone lived together harmoniously like a family. However, one day, her village was attacked and destroyed by goblins. Although the village was devastated, everyone miraculously survived, but they realized that the next time the goblins returned, they might not be so lucky. So they decided to move to a new place. Although she had previously complained about her lack of talent and that no one wanted to team up with her, but she had no intention of giving up on being an adventurer. She was determined to become stronger and protect everyone in the village herself. She added that although she might not look like one, she is very confident in her skills thanks to her years of working in the fields. The wolf had been silently listening to her story until now and realized that, in some ways, they were somewhat similar in his past life. He once thought he was developing a new drug for the benefit of humanity, but the more immersed he became in his work, the more he was seen as an eccentric. This ultimately led him to hate humankind. In contrast to him, she remained optimistic and still had a desire to protect others, even though she herself had been marginalized in a similar way. Finally, they approached a town and Elena pointed ahead, telling the wolf that this was where she lived, a town called Faust. The wolf seemed visibly surprised to see the town, and Elena remarked that it was truly vast. Despite having lived there for some time, she admitted that she couldn't remember all the streets. The town was much larger and more crowded than the wolf had imagined, with facilities he had never seen even in his previous life. Seeing all this, he felt relieved that he had been careful not to infect humans, because if he had, who knows what might have happened. Having arrived, Elena told the wolf that although she would very much like to invite him to the inn to thank him, it was probably impossible. Even though he was new to this world, he understood that a monster couldn't just walk into town, so it was time for them to part ways. He gently touched her foot, trying to reassure her that everything was all right and that she didn't need to worry and that she should just go. Understanding his gesture, she said goodbye, saying she wouldn't forget his kindness and hoped they could meet again someday. The wolf responded with a low growl. After waving goodbye for a while, she finally left, leaving him feeling a little lonely because it had been a long time since he had been able to spend time with someone like that. Nevertheless, he believed it was all right, because if she continued her adventure, perhaps they would meet again. Thinking this, he decided to return to the forest, but suddenly stopped when he thought of the adventurers. His eyes lit up with excitement as he wondered if he could try becoming an adventurer. If he becomes an adventurer, he can travel to many lands, take on quests related to creatures, and enhance his own abilities. However, he knew he couldn't become an adventurer in the form of a wolf. He needed a human body, a body that was both functional and inconspicuous. Taking over the body of someone like Elena who talks so much wouldn't be feasible, as he doubted he could convincingly mimic her, and it would be troublesome if anyone she knew noticed anything unusual. He wondered if he could control a corpse that had lost its identity, but the mere thought made him uneasy, because not only might he look like a zombie, but he also didn't know if he could properly control a corpse. Just then, he realized there was a group of goblins right next to him. Although he wanted to try gathering some more new conditions, he decided that finding a way to obtain a human body should be his top priority. Although he admitted this, he also understood that finding a human body in the forest would not be easy. However, while thinking about humans while looking at the goblins, he realized that goblins were humanoid monsters with human-like bodies and hoods. He might be able to disguise himself as a human and sneak into town. Although it was quite risky, he thought it was worth a try and decided to take on a goblin. But the problem was that he had to get close to the goblin to infect it, and with 5 goblins around, things would be terrible if he were surrounded. Just then, he noticed a goblin that appeared to be infected, which confused him. Then he remembered that it was the same goblin he had infected and spared when he saved Elena. Because there was already one infected goblin, the situation was different now, as he didn't need to fight to infect it. So he decided to quickly capture the goblin, but the problem was he didn't know how, because the first time he transformed his body was when the wolf ate him when he was still a mouse. Although he considered letting the goblins devour him intentionally, the horrific experience of being eaten as a rat made him not want to repeat it. But if there was no other way, he would have to. At that moment, he remembered that when he first woke up as a virus, he had successfully transferred his consciousness to another virus by focusing on it. That worked because, after all, the viruses were a part of him. So he wondered if he could transfer consciousness from here to another viral cell inside the infected goblin. He decided to give it a try and began focusing intensely on the viral cells within the infected goblin. As he concentrated, the goblin began to feel weak, sweating profusely and coughing incessantly. Finally, he succeeded in taking over the goblin's body and gasped for breath, which drew the attention of the other goblins, who all turned to look at him. While inside the wolf's body, he didn't pay much attention to the goblins, but now that he was standing right next to them, he found them terrifying. Suddenly, a goblin approached and called out to him, causing him to panic and wonder if he had done anything strange. The goblin then offered to help him carry the bag. He readily agreed, handing the bag to it while thanking it. This interaction surprised him, making him wonder if he had completely taken over the goblin's consciousness, since, despite their rudimentary nature, he could understand their words. Then another goblin spoke up, expressing empathy as it recalled having been attacked by wolves before the virus took over. Then a female goblin approached and gave him a type of herb, saying it would help him calm down. Not knowing how to react, he simply took it and began chewing. Seeing this, the female goblin told him not to overdo it. These interactions surprised him, as he hadn't expected goblins to be so kind. Ignoring that, he wondered what had happened to the wolf he used to control, so he looked behind the bushes to see and found the wolf looking very confused. Seeing this, he wondered if the wolf's original consciousness had regained control after he left. Unexpectedly, the wolf turned its head to look at him, and the moment their eyes met, the wolf began to growl, then smirked menacingly. Panicked, he immediately warned the other goblins, but the wolf was too close. As they all started running, he realized that with his goblin legs, escape was impossible, so he quickly came up with a plan. Accordingly, he used the infectious properties to spread the virus to other elves. And when the conditions are met, he can impart to them states of physical strength and agility. Thanks to these new states, the group's speed is significantly enhanced. They climbed to higher ground where the wolf couldn't reach them, thus successfully escaping. Now safe, the elves began to celebrate, taunting the wolf that they were faster than it. Though, in reality, it was all thanks to the virus. Putting that aside, he felt relieved that the plan had succeeded and at the same time discovered something important. He could share his status by infecting others with the virus, which could be applied in many ways. Currently, he decided to follow the goblins, as it seemed interesting, and besides, he was gradually getting used to this body. Later, the goblins announced they would return to their lair, still full of energy, which was entirely thanks to him. After a while, they came to a cave guarded by two spear-wielding goblins. As they entered, the two guards saluted formally, causing him to awkwardly return the greeting. Although surprised that the goblins were clever enough to use the cave as a shelter, he found the environment there terrible. Almost everyone wore only loincloths and was skin and bones. Meanwhile, he continued to observe his surroundings. The female goblin reminded everyone that the leader would be angry because there was too little food. While he was still wondering who the leader was, they approached a giant goblin known as Lord Hobgoblin, who was furious because they were late. He was shocked to see Hobgoblin, and while helping the other goblins take food out of their bags, he carefully observed the creature. Although it resembled a goblin, its size was comparable to that of a giant man, making him wonder if this might be an evolved form of goblins. A hobgoblin. When the goblins took out all the food, the hobgoblin asked if that was all. One goblin confirmed, explaining that the orcs had stolen all the prey, leaving nothing to take back. Silently observing the conversation, he noticed that the hobgoblin's movements and body structure were very similar to those of a human. Since this was exactly the type of body he was looking for, he decided to take over the hobgoblin's body. Although this body wouldn't draw too much attention when blending into town, he knew he still needed to deal with the green skin and find suitable clothes. Putting aside his appearance, he concluded that the hobgoblin's body was the closest thing to a human he could find in the forest, and it clearly possessed far more vitality than the goblins. When there was no prey left, Hobgoblin ordered the goblins to attack the human village. One goblin objected, saying that the humans were too strong and they could not win. Enraged, Hobgoblin kicked the goblin in the face, declaring that he was the only one keeping them alive. He stomped on the goblin while yelling for more food and calling it useless. At this point, he came up with a plan and yelled at Hobgoblin, telling him to go find something to eat himself. Hearing this, Hobgoblin angrily asked what he had just said. Now that Hobgoblin had fallen into the trap and was getting closer, he decided to push things further. He loudly declared that Hobgoblin was nothing more than a big, stupid child who only knew how to lie on his throne and beg for food. His reason for deliberately provoking Hobgoblin was that he had mixed virus particles into his breath, and by shouting, he aimed to infect Hobgoblin. This actually worked. However, the system then announced that Hobgoblin had antiviral properties, so the infection would take longer to complete. Despite being surprised to learn about his antiviral abilities, he was still grabbed by the head by the Hobgoblin, which snarled that he was incredibly audacious to defy its lord. Not knowing how long the infection process would take, he decided to struggle in Hobgoblin's hands until it was complete. At that moment, Hobgoblin declared that since the orcs had destroyed the land, he no longer needed the goblins and would leave the area alone. Just then, the system notified the virus that its separation ability was beginning to activate on the target's body. When Hobgoblin smirked and declared that all the goblins would be devoured by orcs, the system confirmed that Hobgoblin's body had been taken over. Virus immediately retorted to Hobgoblin that, before being devoured by the orcs, he would be the one to devour him. At that very moment, Hobgoblin released the goblin's body, causing the remaining goblins to panic and call out their lord's name. Virus, now in control of Hobgoblin's body, he smiled brightly at them. Then he said that everything he had said until now was his sincere thought. But starting today, he had changed his mind and considered everyone a friend, so they should all live in harmony. The system then announced that he had received the conditions for brutal strength, patience, and claws. What surprised him most was that all three were extremely useful in combat. This was understandable as they all came from the leader of the goblins. But his joy was immediately interrupted when the goblin guarding the cave rushed in, reporting that the enemy had appeared just outside. It turned out to be a group of orcs claiming territory, ordering the goblins to immediately withdraw from the area. Virus, now a hobgoblin, emerged from the cave with his sword, followed by the entire horde of orcs, including the wounded. Though reasonably well equipped, they all trembled with fear at the presence of the orcs. Even so, he initially thought they might still have a chance. However, after witnessing firsthand the sheer number and enormous size of the enemy, he felt overwhelmed. He began to understand why the hobgoblin leader had planned to abandon the goblins, because he would have done the same if he were in their shoes. There was no way to defeat the orcs with such a weak and wounded army. However, he had no intention of running away, because his infectious ability not only enhanced himself, but could also impose conditions on others. A capability he discovered while fleeing the wolf as an elf. The current situation also presents an ideal opportunity to test various conditions, and in the worst-case scenario, he can still use the agility boost to escape. With that plan in mind, his only concern was that the goblins were too terrified to fight effectively, even with their enhanced strength. As their leader, he decided to ignite their fighting spirit with an inspiring speech. He infused the virus into his breath again and shouted, urging the goblins not to be afraid. He told them to defend the house with everything they had, emphasizing that they must overcome their fear for they were stronger than they thought, and to give him their full support. While the virus was gradually spreading through each person's body, he began the process of bestowing conditions: physical strength, agility, muscle power, and claws. For now, those are the only conditions he can convey. When the conditions begin to take effect, he noticed the goblins' bodies were changing, and to his astonishment, they were all evolving into a hobgoblin-like form. This transformation far exceeded his expectations, leading him to wonder if the increased muscle strength was the cause. However, he also began to worry that they might become suspicious of this sudden change. Fortunately, the goblins believed their evolution was due to the hobgoblin chief's inspiring speech, which they thought had given them enhanced physical strength. He was genuinely relieved that they were so innocent. Now that this matter was resolved, he decided to proceed with his first large-scale experiment. Witnessing the sudden transformations in the goblins, the orcs became bewildered, wondering if the goblins were using some kind of physical enhancement magic. However, they still believed that the goblins were not intelligent enough to accomplish such a feat. Virus, on the other hand, felt confident in confronting the orcs. For now, the individual strength of each goblin was equal to that of the orcs, not to mention their overwhelming numbers. Unexpectedly, the system notified the virus that it had just detected several new conditions, including invisibility, evasion, fatigue, hunger, and exhaustion. He was surprised by the number of conditions he had acquired simply by infecting all the goblins, and he continued to receive new conditions such as hunger, anemia, agility, light gate, and intuition. Not only that, but existing conditions like temper, night vision, and dexterity were also upgraded to level 2. Since he had never actively used those conditions to develop them, he began to wonder if collecting multiple identical versions of a condition would cause them to merge and become stronger. Realizing this excited him, as it meant he could achieve even more powerful abilities by infecting the orcs. Confident, he taunted them with mocking words, asking where all their earlier cheers had gone, or if they were now as frightened as piglets. An enraged orc immediately lunged at him, shouting that no matter how different the goblins were, they were still just goblins. Forever no match for orcs. Hobgoblin immediately raised his sword and brought it down forcefully on the approaching assailant, finishing him off with a single blow. The sight astonished the goblins, who realized that their leader was much stronger than usual today. Even the orcs noticed that he was moving unusually fast. The truth is, Virus wasn't even sure if he could use the sword skillfully, but it was all thanks to his dexterity reaching level 2. He could use the sword quite proficiently, and although he knew he should be afraid, for some reason a burning fire surged within him. At this moment, more orcs continued to attack him, but he easily took down each one with a single slash, infecting them in the process. With each infection, he acquired new abilities: resilience, strong hands, willpower, pain resistance, and rage. Realizing he had acquired a host of powerful abilities from just a few orcs, he immediately understood that orcs clearly held a much higher position than goblins in the food chain. However, thanks to the conditions he had imparted to the orcs, defeating them would now be no easy feat. He continued to infect even more orcs, acquiring new conditions such as body control, fatigue, regeneration, and enhancement. Meanwhile, the orc chieftain began to realize that they were being outnumbered and outmatched by an unusually large army of goblins. Immediately, he ordered his men to bring out what they had captured the previous day. The henchmen hesitated, explaining that the captured creature was not yet fully tamed and could cause unintended harm. But the orc chieftain, unwilling to be defeated by the goblins, angrily ordered him to release it immediately. At the same time, an orc unexpectedly attacked a goblin and prepared to deliver the finishing blow. However, before the strike could land, negative conditions such as fatigue and anemia triggered, causing the orc to stagger. This gave the goblin enough time to defeat him. It was at this moment that Virus discovered he could actively activate negative conditions on infected creatures, a crucial breakthrough, and all thanks to the orcs. However, at this moment, he began to feel like a god, punishing the orcs for their greed. Even so, a pang of guilt arose within him, feeling it would be unfair to prolong the battle when the outcome was already clear. Therefore, he decided to end the battle immediately. But suddenly a loud clap of thunder rang out, sending a chill down his spine. Startled, he quickly turned around, confused about what had just happened, especially since the thunder had roared despite the almost cloudless sky. Then he realized something enormous was slowly approaching, and as it drew closer, he was stunned to see an orc holding a chain and leading a gigantic, horned bear whose entire body was emitting flashing electricity. A terrified goblin shrieked, quickly identifying the creature as the lightning bear. Hearing this, Virus wondered if it deserved that name because it truly possessed the ability to control electricity. The orc then ordered the bear to attack the goblins, declaring them his prey. But in response, the bear merely glared at the orc, its horns beginning to emit even more powerful electrical currents. And then, it unleashed a thunderous lightning strike, reducing the orc to dust. The Virus was stunned by the terrifying destructive power of that electrical current, and he suddenly realized that the orcs had never trained this creature at all. This made him wonder, how much risk were the orcs willing to take just to avoid defeating the goblins? Clearly, they must have known that bringing that creature here would cause terrible damage. A terrified goblin suggested retreating, as there was no way they could defeat the Thunder Bear, the strongest creature in the region. However, Virus had no intention of backing down because he didn't believe he would lose. Moreover, he was strangely fascinated by the bear's ability to control electricity. There was no way he would miss an opportunity like this. Although he admitted the bear looked incredibly powerful, he was confident that he could infect it. However, he decided to be cautious as the infection could take time. Just like when he was infected by the hobgoblin chieftain, he borrowed a spear from an elf and then cut his own hand to coat the spearhead with blood, which was infected with a virus. He did this because approaching the bear was too dangerous at this point, especially after witnessing an orc being electrocuted to ashes in an instant. He planned to hurl the virus-laced spear at the bear from a safe distance, hoping it would penetrate its skin and infect its target. Once the plan was ready, he threw the spear at Lightning Bear. However, he was stunned to see the spear knocked out by the bear's fur. It was much harder than he had imagined. However, the effort wasn't entirely in vain. Although the spear couldn't penetrate the bear's skin and introduce the virus into its body, he still received 2 new conditions: lightning resistance and weapon-resistant feathers. He speculated that, even though the spear hadn't struck, perhaps some of his blood had splattered into the bear's eye, and that was what had enabled him to obtain these conditions. If that were the case, he began to wonder if he could project his consciousness inside the viral cells that had infiltrated the bear's body. Thinking this, he focused his mind, trying to connect with the viral cells inside the creature. He couldn't connect. All attempts failed. He quickly realized that there weren't enough viral cells in the bear's body for him to transfer his consciousness into. While contemplating how to fix the problem, he noticed a continuous stream of electricity flowing back and forth between the bear's horns and body, leading him to suspect that this constant electrical discharge might be destroying the virus cells inside it. At that moment, the bear stood up straight, beginning to accumulate electricity in preparation for an attack. Seeing this, Virus quickly assumed a defensive stance to block the blow. When the massive lightning strike occurred, he suffered only minor injuries thanks to his newly acquired lightning protection. Unfortunately, the goblins standing next to him did not have that protection. They were burned to ashes on the spot. But the bear didn't stop there. It unleashed another wave of electric shocks, turning even more goblins into dust. Seeing this horrific sight, the remaining goblins immediately retreated to a safe distance, and Virus realized that, given the current circumstances, he was completely incapable of confronting this monster. He silently admitted to himself that he had been overly confident in his current strength, and now he needed to run, because he couldn't afford to lose the hobgoblin body. At that moment, he saw the bear charging up again, preparing to attack the goblins who were so panicked they couldn't even run. He immediately thought of taking advantage of the situation, using the goblins as bait to buy time to escape, but when he saw those faces about to be burned to ashes, he couldn't bring himself to do it. The bear finished charging up its electrical charge and prepared to unleash a devastating lightning strike. At that very moment, Virus lunged forward, using all its strength to ram into the bear, trying to push it away. He couldn't believe he had let his emotions override his reason, leading him to commit such an illogical act. Struggling desperately to stop the monster, he heard anxious calls from the goblins. Unexpectedly, the bear bit his arm, biting so hard that the bone and flesh were crushed, leaving his arm completely paralyzed and unusable. However, he wasn't too worried about his damaged arm. In fact, things were mostly going according to plan. Previously, when attempting to infect the bear through the skin, the virus cells were immediately destroyed by the electric current on the surface. But some cells managed to sneak into its body through its eyes, giving him 2 new conditions. This led him to realize that infection was entirely possible. Because the electricity only covered the outside of the bear's body and wasn't present inside, he deliberately let his blood, which was infected with the virus, flow into its mouth, and the plan succeeded. As soon as the bear swallowed the blood from his injured hand, the virus immediately began to invade from the inside. Fortunately, the bear had no defenses against the virus, so the process happened very quickly. Now that the monster was infected, he didn't hesitate to immediately activate a series of negative conditions: anemia, starvation, exhaustion, weakness, and fatigue. As these negative effects began to manifest, he acquired 3 new conditions: electric shock, electrical absorption, and shock resistance. When the bear was weakened by a series of negative conditions, he immediately activated several enhancements for himself, including claws, body control, weapon-resistant fur, and enhanced arms. Combining these conditions, his hands began to transform, growing sharp claws similar to those of the bear. Seeing that unusual change, the bear sensed something was wrong and immediately decided it had to eliminate Hobgoblin before he became even stronger. It unleashed a powerful lightning strike upon him. However, that attack was completely useless, because he had accumulated so many lightning-resistant conditions that they merged, creating near-total immunity to electricity. The bear's most powerful attack was now pointless, and now it was his turn to counterattack. He channeled all his strength into his claws and unleashed a lightning-fast slash, finishing off the bear with a single blow. Immediately afterward, he received 3 new conditions: create magic, generate electricity, and stimulate. A feeling of relief welled up inside him. He wasn't as overconfident as he had feared, but actually strong enough to defeat the monster. However, using too many conditions at once, coupled with the intensity of the battle, caused serious damage to the hobgoblin's body. He staggered and then collapsed, leaving the goblins both worried and surprised by his claws, which had now become strangely hairy. A few days later, the goblins brought him a pile of food and excitedly showed off the amount of prey they had caught. 3 days had passed since the battle with the Thunder Bear, and during that time, he had been living with the elves to recover. The atmosphere was lively and everyone was cheerful. Because the orcs were gone, the elves no longer feared being hunted, and finding food was easier than before. The reason the goblins appeared to have returned to their original forms was because he temporarily removed the conditions on their bodies, to prevent humans from discovering they were mutated individuals and sending people to exterminate them. Putting that aside, the wounds he sustained in the battle with the Thunder Bear were extremely serious, enough to take the life of any normal creature. But because he was no ordinary being, thanks to his healing abilities and vitality, he had fully recovered. The 2 goblins then offered him a fruit they thought was delicious. He politely declined, saying he was fine and suggesting they eat that part instead. However, the goblins enthusiastically replied that they loved him very much and that it was a special gift they had brought back just for him to enjoy. Sitting amidst the goblins' laughter and innocence, he felt happy. For this was the first time in his life he had been so well liked, even if they were just goblins. That thought made him suddenly feel that perhaps staying here a little longer, continuing to be their leader, wouldn't be so bad after all. Just then, a goblin approached, carrying a strange object, and handed it to him. As he picked it up and examined it, he suddenly remembered his original goal. Although his time living with the elves brought him peace and joy as a virus, he yearned to explore his true limits, to know how far he could go. The goblin gave him a mask, and he wondered if it could help him blend into the human town without being detected. A few days later, when he decided to leave, he began to put on the clothes the goblins had painstakingly found for him. The goblins anxiously asked him if he was really going. He nodded in confirmation, apologizing for his sudden departure. After getting dressed, he found the clothes in this world inconvenient and strange, but guessed that it was probably the common attire here. He then told the goblins that during his battle with the Thunder Bear, he realized he wasn't strong enough, and so he decided to set out to train and become stronger. Hearing this, the goblins burst into tears, protesting that he was already too strong, powerful enough to protect them all, and earnestly begged him not to abandon them. He replied that leaving them was also a very difficult decision for him, but there was no other way. He never thought he could become so deeply attached to something like elves. It was almost like the love a loyal dog has for its owner or something similar. At that moment, the female goblin with teary eyes approached and offered him the skin of the Thunder Bear, something incredibly durable, warm, and useful in many ways. Seeing the goblins sobbing uncontrollably, he couldn't bear it any longer, so he tried to comfort them. He reassured them that they were already very strong, reminding them of how they had bravely fought on equal terms with the orcs. Because they were strong enough to protect their nest, he felt confident enough to set off on his journey to become even stronger. Having said that, he asked them to protect his nest in his place, promising that he would definitely return. Hearing this, the goblins looked at each other, then turned to look at him. Their eyes sparkled with the faith and motivation ignited by that promise. They assured him they would protect his nest and encouraged him to set off without worrying about them. With everything arranged, he finally left for the town with a clear mind, knowing that the area was now free from the threat of the orcs. Before departing, he added some helpful conditions for the goblins to protect themselves, but only to a moderate extent so as not to arouse human suspicion. As the goblins unanimously wished him good luck on his journey and bid him a heartfelt farewell, he secretly promised himself he would visit this place again if he ever passed by. His destination was the town of Faust, the place Elena had mentioned. He realized that even if he were to run into her by chance, she wouldn't recognize him because he was now completely different from when he was a wolf. Nevertheless, he still held on to hope, believing that if he could become an adventurer like her, perhaps he would have the chance to speak to her again. The thought of becoming an adventurer made him quickly check his appearance, wondering if he looked human enough and not too suspicious. Fortunately, he had managed to conceal his distinctive green goblin skin and had also practiced speaking over the past few days. However, he was still unsure if his voice was incomprehensible or whether a hobgoblin like him could communicate fluently with humans. As those thoughts swirled in his head, he realized he was very anxious about entering the human town. He understood that this tension could lead to mistakes and potentially reveal his identity, but he had no other choice as he needed to verify whether his disguise was sufficient to fool others. The problem was he didn't know how to verify it. Just then, a distant roar caught his attention. Following the sound, he came across a horse-drawn carriage surrounded by a pack of wolves, while a group of knights were trying to protect it. As he observed the situation, he saw the knights being gradually overwhelmed by the seemingly endless number of wolves that had appeared out of nowhere. When a knight was struggling with a wolf, he immediately rushed to the rescue and killed it using the invisibility ability. Surprised by his sudden appearance, the knight turned around and asked him who he was and when he arrived. He awkwardly responded with a mispronounced hello. The knights were confused by his words and asked if he meant to greet them. Hearing this, he was overjoyed and relieved, as it meant they still understood what he said. He explained that he had come to help, and the knights immediately asked if that was true. He nodded in confirmation. Seeing that they didn't react aggressively, he breathed a sigh of relief, believing that they hadn't yet realized he was an elf. That made him feel much more at ease. However, the knights misinterpreted his clumsy pronunciation as fear and assumed he was incapable of fighting. Therefore, they advised him to quickly hide behind them for protection. Just then, a wolf lunged from behind, intending to attack him, and a knight shouted a warning. Following the warning, he quickly raised his hand to block the attack. Annoyed at having his conversation interrupted, he immediately slammed the wolf to the ground, finishing it off in an instant. The knights were stunned by his strength, while inside the carriage someone was silently observing the entire scene. At this point, many other wolves began to notice him, and simultaneously charged at him. He quickly realized that if his clothes tore, his green skin might be exposed. To avoid that, he decided to infect the pack of wolves and impose negative conditions to quickly subdue them. As he released virus particles into the air to infect others, the knights also rushed forward to assist him. Before it could be stopped, the virus had already entered the knights' bodies and successfully infected them. As a result, he received conditions such as parry reflexes, dynamic vision, and desertion. He was completely stunned by what had happened, something he had never imagined. He began to panic, not knowing what to do next, because he knew nothing about medicine in this world, yet he had inadvertently infected someone. He feared that if a medieval wizard or physician discovered the viral cells in the knights, they could use something like purification magic to destroy the virus. That could be the beginning of humanity learning of his existence, and they might even develop a vaccine capable of completely eradicating him. Just thinking about it terrified him so much that he unconsciously swung his sword wildly, still bewildered and unsure of what to do next. That action terrified the pack of wolves, causing them to scatter in panic, which greatly impressed the knights who praised his recent feat. Because he had displayed extraordinary strength, far beyond that of a human, the knights assumed he was some renowned swordsman, and respectfully asked to know his face and name. This greatly alarmed him, but before he could react, his attention was drawn to the creaking of hinges emanating from the carriage. Suddenly the car door swung open, and a man wearing a hat stepped out. The man greeted him and expressed his gratitude, saying he didn't know what might have happened if he hadn't arrived in time. Initially, the virus thought the carriage was empty because no one got out to help, or even showed any curiosity about what was happening. But now he realizes there was always someone inside, and he begins to wonder about this person's identity. Then, a knight addressed the man as Lord Roy and asked if he was injured. Roy replied that he was fine and that, thanks to everyone's efforts, the carriage was undamaged. Then Virus and Roy got into the carriage and slowly made their way toward the town of Faust. The knights walked alongside to protect the carriage. Roy thanked the virus once again, saying they were lucky to have met him, then introduced himself as Roy Endhart, a businessman working for the Valkyrie Corporation. He explained that the special smell of the meat they were transporting to the town had probably attracted the wolves and that the soldiers were also exhausted after their long journey. While Roy continued the conversation, Virus was surprised to meet a businessman, and judging by his appearance, the luxurious carriage, and the high-end clothing, he guessed that the man's business was thriving. He considered this a stroke of luck because he currently had absolutely no money, so he might receive a reward for rescuing them when he reached the town. Roy then remarked that even though the knights had retired, he was still disappointed that they had been defeated by the wolves, leaving Virus with no choice but to nod in awkward agreement. Roy continued to praise him, saying that compared to knights, his fighting was truly extraordinary. This was no exaggeration, for he had witnessed many adventurers fight, but had never met anyone like Virus. He also expressed admiration for the young man's courage, not the kind of blind recklessness, but an overwhelming confidence built on genuine ability. Moreover, he didn't even seem tired, which impressed Roy even more. Virus felt incredibly happy to hear such sincere compliments and found Roy endearing, unlike those wealthy or sarcastic people. But Roy didn't stop there. He went on to say that the way the man fought looked as if he had no fear of death. That statement startled the Virus slightly, making it hope Roy was just joking. He is a virus, so he won't disappear until he's completely eradicated by some kind of drug. Thinking about medicine, he suddenly remembered that he needed to gather information about the world's healthcare system. He decided to strike up a conversation naturally, starting by mentioning that many people seem to be getting sick lately. Then he asked Roy how he was doing. Roy replied that he was fine, but he also agreed that there had indeed been many people falling ill recently. He explained that the cause was a tornado filled with toxic gases approaching the city. Not only that, it seems many people have recently discovered a type of crystal containing a very strong magical energy, which has led to cases of mineral poisoning. This information came as a huge surprise to Virus, as it was the first time he had heard of something called toxic gas or mineral-induced disease. He couldn't help but wonder what these diseases were, as they could be diseases unique to this world. Deciding to continue the conversation, he added that besides those diseases, there were also viruses. Roy repeated the word virus and asked what it was, as he had never heard the word before. He also apologized for his lack of understanding on the matter. This truly surprised the Virus, making him wonder if Roy really knew nothing about viruses, even as a businessman, who should have been knowledgeable about many things to serve his business. This meant either the concept of viruses hadn't been discovered in this world yet, or he himself was the only virus existing here. Having inadvertently mentioned the word virus, he quickly fabricated an explanation, saying that viruses were a newly discovered type of crystal. Roy readily believed this lie, although he remarked that the name sounded a bit strange. The Virus felt relieved that it had successfully deceived him. And if the virus had truly never existed or even didn't exist in this world, that means he could infect anyone, like an unlimited buffet. Nevertheless, he decided to act cautiously because these soldiers were quite experienced, something he could sense from the valuable qualities they possessed. He had obtained those qualities from them. Although he had inadvertently infected them once before, the amount of viral cells was probably not enough to obtain all the conditions they possessed. Thinking it would be useful to have more, he increased the density of viruses in their bodies. As a result, he acquired traits such as fighting instinct, dodging, composure, and intuition. While finding these traits very versatile, the system continued to report that he had also acquired characteristics such as stealth, deception, cunning, and drug resistance. This astonished the Virus, and he found those characteristics particularly alarming. He then asked Roy if those soldiers were his subordinates. Roy replied that, except for the coachman, none of them were employees of the company. They were merely mercenaries he had hired to escort him safely through the forest. Roy found it rather ironic that, despite having hired mercenaries to protect him, they were all ultimately saved by someone completely different, making him wonder what he had hired them for in the first place. While still harboring doubts about the reliability of those soldiers, the system unexpectedly announced the detection of a new set of qualities: calmness, negotiation, persuasion, and appeasement. This greatly confused the Virus, as these were not qualities typically possessed by mercenaries. He wondered where those conditions came from, but then realized, because the carriage window was open, Roy had also been infected. This made him realize that spreading the virus in a confined space was a bad idea. However, nothing could be changed now, and he only hoped this wouldn't cause any trouble later. It wasn't entirely a bad thing, though, as Roy's merchant-friendly properties would be very helpful to him as he began his life in town. Putting that aside, the virus began to speculate that, based on Roy's qualifications, he must be an extremely skilled businessman, which also meant he could be a target for rival merchants. And given the suspicious qualifications of those mercenaries, it was highly likely they were hired to eliminate Roy. Although it's currently just speculation, if that were to actually happen and he saved Roy's life once again, he would probably receive a double reward. That meant his research and living expenses would be covered right here. With that in mind, he told Roy that the mercenaries looked very suspicious. However, Roy didn't hear him, and instead pointed out the window and told him to look outside. Since they had arrived in the town of Faust, although Roy guessed he had probably been there before, he politely reintroduced them, stating that this was indeed the town of Faust. They both got out of the car, where Roy told him to wait a moment because the contract with the mercenaries ended there and he needed to handle some paperwork. Seeing the mercenaries dismissed, Virus wondered if his initial suspicion that they were plotting to kill Roy was just unfounded worry. After seeing the soldiers off, Roy turned back to thank him for his patience, then said that because he owed him a great debt of gratitude for saving his life, he decided to give him a gift. Hearing this, the virus was extremely excited, secretly wondering if it was money or not. He was sure it would be money, but Roy gave him a card instead, explaining that it was a Valkyrie Company card, something only given to special individuals. Virus was slightly disappointed that it wasn't what he expected, but still found the card quite nice. Roy went on to explain that he could use the card to get a discount on any product from the Valkyrie Company, and if anyone needed anything from Roy, they just had to present the card. Hearing this, Virus realized it was a kind of utility card, something he found very useful in his current situation, as he had no connections in this world. At this moment, having a supporter was even more valuable than money. He then told Roy that this was his first time in the city and he didn't know anyone, so if he ever got into trouble in the future, he hoped Roy could help him. Roy happily accepted his offer and assured him that whenever his benefactor needed help, he would be there immediately. Although Virus felt a little guilty for taking advantage of such a kind person, he understood that there was no other way. Because his relationship with a businessman would be incredibly useful, he decided to take advantage of this opportunity as much as possible. So, he secretly used his infectious abilities to increase the number of virus cells in Roy's body. As a result, he gained many new conditions, and eagerly awaiting the system's announcement, he was stunned to realize those conditions included assassination, soundproofing, invisibility, level 2 secrecy, presence detection, level 2 concealment, dark magic, talent, and acting. These conditions were so bizarre that they shocked him, causing him to tremble all over. Just then, Roy took a bag of gold coins from his assistant and decided to give it to him as a thank you. However, Virus immediately refused, citing that he couldn't accept money just for doing a good job. He then quickly apologized, saying that he had just remembered something extremely important and had to leave immediately. Without hesitation, he turned and fled, realizing he had been far too careless. The suspicious information he had gathered from the carriage hadn't come from the mercenaries, but from Roy himself. If he wanted to live peacefully and continue his research, he absolutely couldn't get involved with Roy any further. This left Roy utterly confused because the virus had just said it was his first time in town, that he didn't know anyone. So what could be so urgent that he had to leave in such a hurry? Thinking it over, Roy wondered if the virus had detected something before fleeing, but in the end he decided not to think about it anymore. After all, the virus had its own secrets that it didn't want to share. Because they were somewhat similar, Roy believed they would cooperate well, and he was especially looking forward to doing business with the virus in the future. After running around frantically for a while, he stopped in a small alley to catch his breath. He believed that running away the moment he realized Roy might be a killer was the right decision. But now he wondered if it was really necessary, because he had already infected Roy, meaning that if there was a fight, he would definitely be stronger. However, he can't be blamed. This was the first time he'd encountered a killer in real life, so it's natural to be scared. Putting that aside, after running until he was exhausted, he decided to take a walk around town to find a place to rest. Despite mentally preparing himself for this different world, he was still amazed by the racial diversity of its inhabitants. Just as he was getting excited, wondering what interesting things he might discover, someone called out loudly from behind him. Turning around, he saw someone who looked like a hobbit, who told him he couldn't be loitering outside their 3-star hotel in such a disheveled state. Hearing this, he realized it was a hotel. He asked if he could stay, but the hobbit just gave a wry smile and flatly refused, saying they had no rooms for suspicious-looking people like him. Having no other option, he went to another hotel and asked the cat-like man standing outside if he could rent a room. The cat-like man gave a wry smile and bluntly replied that he looked too suspicious to be allowed to stay. He tried his luck again at another hotel, where an old elf man said he smelled like a sewer and looked like a murderer, though it was none of his business. But if you don't have money, don't even think about renting a room. Being treated so badly on his very first day in town made him just want to go back to the goblin lair. He hastily told the old man that although he had no money, he had a few items he could sell, but the old man immediately shouted that they only accepted cash. A feeling of despair overwhelmed him, making him realize that the human world wasn't as good as he had imagined. Then the old man informed him that he could sell his belongings at the Adventurers Guild for cash. Although surprised to hear about the Adventurers Guild, he listened attentively as the old man explained that if rumors spread that he was letting someone stay for free, it would cause a lot of trouble later. However, if he could earn even a small amount of money from the association, he could still rent a room even if he was short of cash. Hearing this, he realized that there were kind-hearted people in this world. Not long after, he arrived in front of the Adventurers Guild building. Upon entering, he expected it to look like an office. But the reality was quite different. It looked no different than a crowded pub on a Friday night. He secretly praised it as an excellent business idea because adventurers, after receiving their payment, would certainly be willing to spend it on the spot. Immediately, seeing the large crowd, he realized that if he spread the virus now, he could gather a lot of information. However, he decided to act cautiously, avoiding causing a major commotion until he had a better understanding of the town. As he entered, searching for a place to sell his belongings, he noticed all eyes were on him. This made him realize his appearance was far too striking, and with no other option, he quickly decided to sell the electric bear fur and quietly leave without attracting any further attention. At that moment, he saw a beautiful girl waving at him from behind the counter, making him guess she was probably the receptionist. He immediately approached, awkwardly greeted her, and received a return greeting from her, who then asked if he was new. When he nodded in confirmation, the girl pushed a piece of paper toward him and explained it was an adventurer's application. Her enthusiasm for recruitment surprised him, so he hastily explained that he came from a remote rural area and had no identification papers whatsoever. She reassured him that it was all right, because the Adventurers Association operated entirely on a merit-based system. They always welcomed anyone, even those in similar circumstances, and their staff was always short on personnel, so it wouldn't be a problem. Then she offered to help him fill out the application and asked for his name. He thought for a moment. He decided to use his real name. But since this was a new life, he decided to create a new name and introduce himself as Walker Parasite. The name Walker is a translation of his old name into English, while Parasite, he believes, comes from the French word meaning parasite. Although it was just a spur-of-the-moment idea, the name felt very fitting to him, even though he wasn't actually a parasite. After completing the registration, the receptionist handed him a name tag along with a level 6 adventurer's card to confirm his rank. She informed him that if he leveled up to level 4, this card would be usable as official identification everywhere. This made it incredibly useful. Taking the card and name tag, he analyzed it and found it quite similar to the military name tags from his previous world. At this point, the receptionist added that starting alone was difficult, but because he looked so muscular, she believed he would soon form a team, as he exuded the aura of a promising rookie. Since this seemed to be his first time as an adventurer, she decided to help him choose a suitable quest. She suggested either a rank F quest like gathering herbs, or a rank E quest like eliminating horned rabbits. Before she could offer any further suggestions, he interrupted her, pulled out an electric bear fur coat, and asked if it could be sold there. This surprised her greatly as she learned he had hunted such trophies even before becoming an adventurer. But when she looked more closely at the fur, the receptionist was completely stunned to realize it was the fur of an S-class electric bear, a monster that had just been added to the kill list in a suppression mission. Because she accidentally blurted it out, all the attention in the hall immediately shifted to them, and everyone started whispering about the electric bear. The receptionist then asked Walker, the virus's new name, how he had obtained the electric bear's fur. He replied that he had subdued it and asked if there was any problem. Upon learning that the electric bear was a monster officially slated for extermination, he realized the situation was quite serious, and his public admission of having killed it would undoubtedly draw unnecessary attention to himself. However, the receptionist reassured him that there was no problem. It was simply unbelievable that someone could defeat such a powerful electric monster alone. Walker quickly apologized and explained that he was just boasting a little and that he had actually taken it down with a group of 20 people, which wasn't wrong since he was with 20 goblins at the time. He also added that defeating the monster was so difficult that many people lost their lives, but somehow they still managed to complete the mission, which perfectly fits the image of a promising rookie like himself. His story was quite convincing, but the receptionist still found it hard to believe. However, she decided not to press him further. She then explained that as long as he completed his tasks, the guild staff wouldn't question him about the details. Since he had provided proof of killing the Thunder Bear, she took out a bag of gold and gave it to him as a reward. While everyone in the guild was staring at him, he quickly took the bag of gold and put it in his jacket pocket. He felt relieved to finally have some cash. Now that things were more or less settled, he decided to leave as soon as possible because he wasn't good at socializing. And besides, being the center of attention like this wasn't pleasant. Nevertheless, he still felt secretly lucky that he hadn't been questioned further. His friend realized that this place was quite dangerous, as they accepted anyone, possibly even criminals. He also suspected that although the receptionist looked friendly and normal, she was certainly very skilled, as he noticed some scratches on her. Not only that, even though she was dressed modestly, he could still tell that she regularly trained hard. Thinking he could gain something useful from her, he was considering infecting her right now. Lost in thought, he didn't notice his gaze unintentionally drifting down to her chest. When she suddenly coughed softly, he was startled and quickly clarified that he hadn't been looking there. She immediately asked him to step aside so the next person could complete the procedure. This made him feel extremely awkward. When he turned around to tell the next person that he was finished, he was surprised to realize that the person waiting was Elena. He stood frozen, too shocked to see her. He still managed to respond immediately when Elena asked if it was her turn. She then complimented him, saying it was amazing that he could take down an electric bear, showering him with praise. Then she walked to the reception desk while Walker was still incredibly surprised, completely unprepared to see her there. Seeing her handing over the herbs to the receptionist, he guessed that she had indeed resumed her adventurous work, which made him very happy. While the receptionist praised Elena for the perfect quantity and quality of the herbs, Walker ordered a beer and sat down in a nearby chair. He desperately wanted to talk to her, worried about how things had gone for her after their encounter in the forest. However, he couldn't, because when he saved her, he was in wolf form, so she wouldn't recognize him now, and his sudden approach would only make things more suspicious. Unexpectedly, after receiving her herbal reward, Elena asked the receptionist about joining a team. The receptionist immediately apologized and said that no teams had yet wanted to recruit her. Although this news saddened her somewhat, she remained calm because she was quite used to this kind of thing. Having overheard their conversation, Walker realized Elena was still operating alone, which made sense. Since the adventurers here all looked very strong, accompanying them would likely only be a burden. Despite feeling guilty for her, he convinced himself that it was for her own good, as she was clearly not suited to this kind of harsh adventurers guild. As Elena left the guild, a man called out to her from behind. This made Walker wonder if she was about to be invited to join the team. Elena then turned back and responded awkwardly, addressing him as Mr. Gajiru. While Walker secretly hoped the man would leave Elena alone, as she was completely unsuitable for this kind of dangerous work, Gajiru asked if she had found a team yet, to which she replied that she hadn't. Gajiru feigned sympathy, saying he understood her feelings and that he would love to take her into his team, but his current squad had no room for rookies. Then, with a sarcastic tone, he added that there was no way he could ignore a dreamy country girl like her. Then, Gajiru suggested she take on another job, but before he could finish his sentence, Elena stepped back, hastily stating that she had already declined the offer. Witnessing this, Walker understood that they had no intention of hiring her at all. Although he desperately wanted to help, the recent chaotic situation prevented him from risking making a further impression. However, he believed that with such a large crowd, someone with a sense of justice would surely step forward to stop them. However, instead of helping, everyone around her started laughing and mocking Elena, saying she would earn more money doing a different job instead of gathering herbs. Seeing this, Walker felt disgusted, wondering what was wrong with these people that no one was willing to help. Just then, Gajiru put his arm around Elena's shoulder and told her to follow him so she could at least see the job he was offering. Elena was on the verge of tears, crying and screaming as she begged Gajiru to let go. Witnessing this, Walker suddenly remembered the moment Elena had confided in him about her desire to become stronger in order to protect her village. That memory was unbearable for him. He immediately spoke up, shouting at Gajiru to stop because Elena didn't like it at all. Hearing this, Gajiru turned around, bursting into a mocking laugh, taunting Walker, sarcastically remarking that his voice sounded like that of a disgusting goblin. Then the man glared at Walker and sternly warned him that he was just an outsider and should best not interfere if he didn't want trouble. In response, Walker frankly stated that he was a teammate of the girls. That statement left Elena stunned and utterly surprised. Gajiru laughed mockingly, saying Walker must be crazy to team up with trash like her. He then assumed Walker had the same goal as him. Then he bluntly asked if he worked in the same industry. He even shamelessly added that a useless person like Elena was only fit to be sold. But at least he was the one who discovered her first. After saying that, Gajiru unexpectedly threw a punch at Walker. However, Walker easily blocked it simply by grabbing his hand. Stunned, Gajiru struggled to break free but couldn't. And it was at that moment that he was forced to realize Walker was stronger than him, though he still refused to accept it. Since prolonging the fight would only cause trouble, Walker exhaled virus cells through his protective helmet, silently infecting Gajiru. After significantly weakening him with negative status effects, he immediately used magic and electromagnetic discharge, unleashing a lightning bolt that struck Gajiru directly. Gajiru collapsed to the ground, his whole body still trembling from the electric shock. Witnessing this scene, the members of his team began to panic and clamored to ask what was happening. The mage in Gajiru's group, who had appeared earlier, had judged Walker to be a fighter based on his physique. But now discovering he was a mage, he became confident he wouldn't lose. Claiming to be the fastest spellcaster in the entire group, he began chanting a spell to attack. But then the sorcerer suddenly realized that Walker hadn't chanted a spell when he cast the lightning magic. While he was still bewildered, wondering how he did it, Walker unleashed another lightning strike directly at him. Immediately afterward, the Beastman in Gajiru's group silently approached from behind, drew his knife, and stabbed Walker directly. However, he held out his hand to block it, allowing the blade to pierce his palm. The Beastman, astonished, asked if he felt any pain. But before he could react further, he was knocked out with just one punch. The entire group of adventurers fell silent as they witnessed Gajiru and her companions being overwhelmingly defeated. The eerie silence made Walker extremely tense. The silence was finally broken when someone asked who Walker was, and why Gajiru had lost so easily. Even Elena couldn't hide her astonishment. Realizing he had gone a little too far, Walker immediately bowed his head and apologized to Elena, saying that he had acted excessively. Elena was about to say something when Walker noticed the receptionists whispering to each other, which filled him with anxiety. Unable to linger any longer, he hurried out of the hall. He apologized to Elena once more for the trouble, then rushed through the hall's doors. Elena's eyes widened as if she had just realized something. She immediately chased after him, calling out to him to wait. When Walker stopped, she thanked him for saving her, then hesitated as if about to say something. After gathering her courage, she asked if he would be willing to team up with her. As soon as she finished speaking, Elena looked at him with a determined gaze. Walker was surprised by the offer, not understanding what she was talking about. First, he countered by asking if she didn't find what he had done earlier strange. But Elena immediately replied emphatically no, because she understood he was only doing it to help her. Although she knew that suddenly suggesting they form a team was somewhat illogical, she still believed he was the only one who could help her. Walker quickly refused, saying that based on what he had just witnessed, it would be best for her not to get involved in such dangerous work. He apologized and advised her to quit the job and find a more stable career. Elena just smiled and said it was okay, though with a touch of disappointment, she was used to being rejected, so she told him not to worry. She said she would continue gathering herbs until she found someone to form a team with. Hearing this, he asked if she still intended to continue, despite everything she had been through. Elena replied confidently that of course she did, because becoming an adventurer and protecting people was her dream. Seeing her unwavering determination, he began to consider whether he should team up with her as an experiment. Since he still didn't fully understand this world, he felt he needed someone trustworthy, not someone who would simply follow in her footsteps. Whether Elena was strong or weak didn't matter. What mattered was that she seemed trustworthy. So he decided to team up with her. Then he turned away, avoiding Elena's gaze, and said that he was actually looking for a team himself. If she agreed, they could try working together as their first adventure together. He offered to split the reward equally and added that he would teach her how to fight properly. Elena was so shocked that her whole body trembled and she burst into tears. He panicked, asking her what was wrong, whether his offer wasn't good enough, or if she had been injured earlier. Elena quickly apologized, saying she didn't mean to cry, that he had just surprised her. She explained that she had become so accustomed to loneliness that she didn't know how to react or express joy. She confessed that she thought she would be rejected again, so when he agreed, she was overwhelmed with emotion. She sincerely thanked him from the bottom of her heart. He simply nodded slightly and replied naturally that it was nothing. He somewhat understood her feelings based on his memories of a past life. That feeling of hitting rock bottom, he understood it very well. She smiled brightly, and Elena immediately asked if he wanted to celebrate with her, as she also wanted to know more about him. Then they both went to a pub. Elena told him to order whatever he liked as a way of thanking him for helping her. Unfamiliar with the world's cuisine, he decided to order the same as Elena, the dish of the day. Although he felt a little guilty letting her pay when he had just earned a decent amount, he accepted it because he understood it was her way of showing gratitude. When the waiters brought the food, Elena suddenly remembered she hadn't introduced herself, so she quickly said her name was Elena, a rank 6 rookie. Walker responded, introducing himself as Walker Parasite, a newly registered adventurer. Elena was surprised that he had only recently become an adventurer, as she had assumed he was a seasoned veteran, knowing he had once defeated an electric bear. Walker then fabricated a story saying that he grew up in a remote mountain village, lived as a hunter, and was just a naive fool who had wandered into the city. He admitted that he lacked some basic knowledge about the city, and added that he was self-taught in combat and therefore couldn't teach much, but he would try his best. Completely believing his story, Elena offered to help him adjust to city life, assuring him that she would be fine, learning to fight simply by observing him. When he replied that it would be a great help, Elena recalled the scene of him using magic earlier and praised him for being extraordinary and being able to use both magic and martial arts. Just as he was about to blurt out that he could use magic because he was a virus, he stopped himself and simply smiled in agreement, saying that magic was indeed very useful. This made him realize that if he said too much, he would easily reveal his true identity. So he decided to invent a plausible reason and use the opportunity to gather more information about magic, so he could be better prepared later. Just as he was thinking about what to make up, the waiter brought out the food, much to his excitement. It had been a long time since he'd had a meal like this. However, he quickly remembered that he was wearing a helmet to conceal his hobgoblin face and panicked, unsure how to eat. While he was still racking his brains, Elena pointed out that he couldn't start eating while still wearing the helmet. Walker quickly fabricated an excuse, saying he couldn't take off his hat because he had so many deep scars on his face, which was also why his voice sounded so strange. Elena was shocked to hear this and immediately apologized for her thoughtlessness. Walker reassured her that it was all right and told her not to worry. Seeing this, Elena immediately asked the waiter to pack up the meal to take away. Walker quickly apologized for not informing her beforehand, but Elena calmly replied that it was no problem, as such injuries were not uncommon in this dangerous profession. Elena then shared that her village had once been attacked by a hobgoblin, resulting in many deaths and leaving the elderly and young children homeless. That's why she's determined to become a powerful adventurer, to protect everyone. She also asserts that she will never forgive the goblins for what they did to her homeland. Hearing that, Walker couldn't help but feel both confused and worried, because the person she was talking to was a hobgoblin. Guilt for deceiving Elena began to creep into his heart. He secretly thought that if he wanted to continue living among humans, he needed to find a human body soon. But until then, he had promised himself he would do everything he could to ensure Elena never discovered his true identity. Lost in thought, he was startled when Elena suddenly called his name. She smiled and thanked him for agreeing to team up with a stranger like her, then said that she was very lucky to have met him. Walker gently replied that she shouldn't thank him yet, as he hadn't done anything for her. Instead, he thanked her for accepting him. Despite his appearance, Elena said that her grandmother had taught her never to judge a book by its cover. Walker realized that she was very innocent and kind, but also quite naive. He worried that even a moment of carelessness would get her into trouble. So he decided to always be vigilant and ready to protect her if anything happened. When the waiter brought the packaged meal, Elena handed it to him and told him to eat slowly. Finally, Walker thanked her, then offered to escort her back to where she was staying, as the men from earlier might return and endanger her later. As they walked together, Walker apologized for unexpectedly offering to join them. Elena replied that it was all right. Although she wasn't sure if he would believe her, she decided to tell him that the day before, while she was in the woods, a wolf had helped her get back to town. He was surprised to learn that she still remembered it. Elena explained that what he had just done felt very similar to what the wolf had done. Walker feigned innocence, asking if a real monster could actually do such things. Elena insisted that it had indeed happened, even claiming she had spoken to the wolf. She naively wondered if she had the talent to tame monsters. Not wanting to complicate the conversation further, Walker quickly changed the subject, saying that since tomorrow would be their first time working together, she should get some rest and eat properly beforehand. While Elena's eyes sparkled with excitement, Walker felt a little nervous as this was their first time venturing together. He only hoped their coordination would gradually improve over time, and since it had been a long time since he'd worked with someone like this, he was starting to feel excited. The next day, while Walker was still fast asleep in the inn, Elena suddenly called out his name, greeting him good morning in a very loud voice. Walker woke up with a start, quickly jumping out of bed when he realized Elena was there. She called out to him from the front of the inn, asking if this was where he was staying. Seeing her standing outside the window, he felt relieved that she wasn't right in front of his room. He wondered why she had come here when they had arranged to meet at the meeting place and there was still an hour left. While he was silently admiring her enthusiasm, Elena unexpectedly entered the inn and asked the innkeeper if there was a guest named Walker Parasite staying there. The innkeeper confirmed that there was indeed a guest with that name in the front room on the second floor. As Elena went upstairs, Walker hurriedly got dressed, muttering discontentedly that the people here seemed to have no sense of privacy, readily revealing guest information to anyone. After getting dressed, he quickly left the room and found Elena breathless on the stairs. He greeted her good morning and asked how she knew he was there. She greeted him back and explained that she had found his place by asking locals if anyone had seen a large man wearing a black cloak and a bird-shaped mask. Hearing this, Walker felt extremely uneasy, because although he knew this body was quite distinctive, he didn't expect it to be so easily recognizable. Therefore, he thought he needed to quickly find a replacement body, and also felt guilty for deceiving Elena. While he was lost in thought, Elena called his name, startling him. He quickly responded, asking what was wrong. She anxiously inquired if he had changed his mind about forming the group, as he seemed somewhat distracted. He immediately denied it and insisted that the plan remained unchanged. He explained that this collaboration also benefited him, as he was new to town and needed a lot of help. Then he suggested that since today was their first adventure as a team, they should leave right away. Elena happily agreed with a radiant smile. Afterward, they both walked through the bustling market on their way to the Adventurers Guild. Walker felt incredibly excited, as he had never had the chance to properly explore the town before. Therefore, there were many things he had never seen. Just then, a saleswoman called him over, and when he approached, she offered him a drink called Kaglam juice, saying that because he looked like he was from out of town, she would give him a special discount, charging only 10 silver coins. Since he had earned some money selling the lightning bear's fur, he decided to try buying it. But at that moment, Elena stopped him and pushed him aside. She told the woman that 10 silver coins was double the market price for that kind of drink. Caught in the act of overcharging, the woman forced a smile and quickly corrected herself, saying she meant 2 glasses for 10 coins. Hearing this, Walker said he would take 2 glasses, which annoyed her, but she reluctantly took another one. Elena then advised Walker not to trust people too easily, explaining that the recent incident was a common trick at the market to sell goods at a higher price than they actually were. Hearing this, Walker thought she was being contradictory, since she herself had blindly trusted a stranger to form a team. But he couldn't say it directly, so instead he complimented her, saying it was great that she had experience with things like that. Elena replied that it was normal because she couldn't make money right away like he did. She added that there were times when they were so destitute that they had to survive by eating weeds and herbs they gathered from missions just to save money. Hearing this, Walker was surprised and worried, saying that if she was that poor, she shouldn't have treated him to lunch yesterday. Seeing his concern, Elena quickly reassured him that it was all right, as she had saved up some money for special occasions like this. Hearing this, he was deeply moved and wondered how a girl could be so kind. Now, Walker is determined to complete a few tasks so Elena can get to eat delicious food. While sipping his juice, he told Elena they should hurry to the Adventurers Guild to receive their quest, and after collecting their reward, they would return to the market. Elena agreed with a radiant smile, but also expressed concern that he might be tricked again like before. Therefore, she declared that she would keep a close eye on him, to make sure he didn't fall into her trap again. Walker thanked her for her help, thinking it was only fair, as he also intended to keep an eye on her to make sure she didn't cause any trouble. Later, when they arrived at the Adventurers Guild and informed the receptionist that they had formed a team, the receptionist was utterly astonished. The receptionist asked Elena again if she really wanted to team up with this person, and Elena confidently replied yes. While Walker felt a little awkward, Elena explained that although his appearance was somewhat unusual, he was actually a very good person, as proven by his help to her yesterday. Although the receptionist acknowledged it, she avoided eye contact when looking at Walker, and instead stared intently at him, making him feel extremely uncomfortable. He realized that she was very suspicious of him, and not just her, but the other adventurers in the guild were also staring at him, probably because of what happened yesterday. He immediately tried to appear harmless by forcing a smile under his hood and asking the receptionist if there were any suitable tasks for two newcomers like them. Despite her doubts, the employee thought that with the strength he displayed yesterday, he was more than capable of handling an S-rank mission, and was confident that he had single-handedly defeated the Electric Bear. Unable to argue against that, Walker explained that they were looking for a suitable mission that could help Elena further develop her skills. Hearing this, the employee checked the mission list and, after consideration, suggested the horned rabbit hunting mission. She explained that the main task was collecting rabbit horns, which were often used as decorations, so these rabbits were frequently targeted in collection missions. She also added that their solitary nature was quite unusual for their size, and therefore, they were ideal targets for newcomers to the profession. After she finished explaining, Elena immediately accepted the task and promised to do her best. Once the task was accepted, Walker reassured the receptionist that there was no need to worry, as he would support Elena. However, it was his support that worried her. She held Elena's hand and told her to be very careful, to which Elena awkwardly replied that she would be. Walker only hoped the receptionist didn't think he was like Gajiru and his group, but he knew his first impression was terrible. He wondered if he could improve that by doing well on missions with Elena. He thought that if he completed a few missions correctly with Elena, he could gradually gain people's trust. Then they went to the forest where the horned rabbits were supposed to live, but somehow they couldn't find a single one. Because they had been searching for hours, Walker asked Elena if these rabbits were rare. Elena replied that they weren't rare and weren't usually hard to find. However, since she didn't see any at all, she suspected that goblins might have appeared nearby, which could explain the rabbit's disappearance. Hearing this, Walker panicked. He thought it might be his fault because as a hobgoblin, the rabbits might have sensed his presence from afar and immediately fled. If that were the case, finding them would be very difficult. However, he didn't want their first mission to fail. He told Elena that he would use magic to find the rabbits, but that it could be dangerous, so he asked her to step back. Somewhat confused, she agreed and stepped back, asking if magic would really help find them. Walker then spread the viral cells, intending to use the conditions he had obtained from Roy. He activated his level 2 stealth skill to erase all traces of a hobgoblin, then used his presence sensing skill to sense living creatures around him. When this skill combination is activated, he immediately noticed something inside a hollow log nearby. He quickly informed Elena that he sensed something inside the log, and suggested they check it together. This impressed Elena immensely. She even called him a genius because the magic he had just performed was a high-level spatial perception spell. Walker responded, confused, claiming that he grew up in the mountains and therefore didn't know what was so special about it. When everything was settled, Elena said that before continuing, she had something she wanted to ask. She hoped he wouldn't use any magic to enhance her, even though that request sounded strange for someone as weak as her. She wanted to grow stronger through her own efforts. Walker assured her that he wouldn't do that because it would be better that way, since he couldn't always be by her side anyway. Elena thanked him for his understanding. Walker later realized that before arriving in town, he enjoyed using his powers to infect monsters and collect as many conditions from them as possible. But now, thinking back, he realized there were still many things about the virus he didn't fully understand, such as how after infecting someone, he had absolutely no idea how to remove it. Therefore, even though he wanted to use his abilities to make Elena stronger, he shouldn't use them on her. He then suggested that they quickly check the log before the rabbit ran away, and she agreed. As they approached, Walker explained that they would block both ends of the log to prevent the rabbit from escaping, and warned Elena to be careful on her side. When he bent down to look inside, Elena immediately warned him that it wasn't a good idea because horned rabbits have a very strong lunge. However, it was too late because before he could dodge, the horned rabbit lunged and rammed straight into his helmet. This caused his hat to pop open, revealing his hobgoblin face. Luckily, he closed it just in time before Elena saw it. Worried, she asked if he was all right, and he replied that he was fine, and quickly asked about the rabbit. She reassured them that it wouldn't get far because its horns made it move slower than a normal rabbit. She then suggested they chase after it immediately, and Walker agreed. After the recent incident, he felt utterly useless, and although Elena was weak, she was far more capable than him. As they chased the rabbit, it quickly darted towards a burrow. When Walker tried to stop it, Elena quickly told him to halt. Then she explained that the burrow the rabbit was trying to get into, along with many other burrows around it, belonged to rock rats. He then asked what rock rats were. She explained that rock rats are medium-sized monsters, stronger than horned rabbits. Just then, a rock rat emerged from the ground, while Elena continued to explain that they eat the soil, which then hardens into a layer of rocky armor surrounding their bodies. She added that the rock armor was a special type of rock that was very difficult to break through. As more rock rats continued to emerge, seeing the sheer number of opponents, Walker asked Elena if she could catch the horned rabbit, while he would deal with the swarm of rock rats. She replied that she could do it, and assured him to leave the task to her, assuring him that she would at least be able to keep him occupied. However, she still worriedly asked if he could handle so many of them by himself. He reassured her that he would be fine, as he was confident in his own strength, and besides, he could use magic, which was actually the virus cells he was releasing. Thanks to this, he successfully infected all the surrounding monsters and acquired the following abilities: Stab Jump, Quick Vision, Eat Big, Claw Hook, Dig, Stone Skin, and Numbing Fluid. Additionally, he regained the Danger Detection skill, which he then merged with and upgraded to level 2. Now that he's infected the horned rabbit, he no longer has to worry about what might happen to Elena, although she probably wouldn't be happy to know. But there was no other way, because with her current strength, she was very easily seriously injured. Therefore, he decided to weaken the horned rabbit a little so that Elena could accumulate more confidence on her own. When the horned rabbit ran away and the rock rats rushed in, Walker told Elena to quickly chase after the rabbit, while he would deal with the rock rats. Following his instructions, she immediately chased after the horned rabbit, while Walker used his sword to block the attack of a rock rat. This made him realize that although they were quite strong, they were nothing compared to a hobgoblin like him, so there was no need to do anything special. He quickly activated the brutal strength condition and slammed the rock rat to the ground. When the other rock rats lunged to attack, he accurately slashed at their unprotected bellies, easily taking them down. Having dealt with the rats, he began to worry about Elena, because even though the horned rabbit was small, she might still have difficulty catching it. If she struggled to keep up, he planned to activate some conditions to weaken the horned rabbit. However, when he controlled the horned rabbit, he was surprised to discover that Elena was not only completely focused, but also attacked very skillfully and swiftly with her sword. Seeing this, he immediately relinquished control of the rabbit. Observing their fight from a third-person perspective, he was surprised to find Elena and the horned rabbit evenly matched. This made him wonder why she had been so easily overwhelmed by those goblins before. However, observing her battle, he realized Elena was overly focused on her immediate opponent, and thus understood why she had previously struggled against the goblins. That's because she lacks spatial awareness, making her vulnerable to multiple enemies at once. Considering she's always operated alone, Elena probably never realized this weakness. He thought that if he supported her in time and let her fight hand-to-hand, she could certainly unleash her true potential. At that moment, Elena successfully struck the rabbit's horn, causing it to break off and fall to the ground. Without its heavy horns, the rabbit became more agile and immediately ran away. Since the task only required collecting the horns, Elena did not chase after it. She picked up the horn, her face still full of astonishment, then turned to Walker and told him that she had actually done it. He replied that he had watched the entire battle and found it truly amazing. Elena was so surprised by her success that she asked Walker if he had used magic to help her. He replied that he had done nothing, and that it was entirely thanks to her strength that he was able to defeat the horned rabbit. Therefore, he asserted that he truly believed she had the talent to become an adventurer. Hearing this, Elena unexpectedly burst into tears, causing Walker to panic and quickly ask why she was crying again. She apologized, saying that she couldn't control herself because it was the first time someone had said such things to her. Walker then added that since this was his first assignment, he wasn't entirely confident in his own judgment. Elena nodded in agreement and promised to do her best from now on so as not to disappoint him. Then they both went to the Adventurers Guild. After handing over the rabbit horn, they received 2 bags of gold as a reward for completing the quest. The receptionist even praised Elena, saying that it was an extraordinary achievement for a rank 6 adventurer to complete the horned rabbit hunting quest on their first try. Elena clutched the bag of gold tightly in her hands, her heart pounding with surprise. She anxiously asked what she should do, as she had never received such a large sum of money before. Walker told her she should be proud and feel free to spend as much as she wanted, because she was the one who had defeated the horned rabbit. Elena smiled and replied that she only managed to do it with his support. Then she remembered a bag she had always dreamed of buying and asked if she could go buy it. Walker immediately replied that of course and asked if she wanted to go to the market right away. Elena explained that the bag she wanted was quite special, so there were many fakes at the market. So she decided to buy from a reputable store she knew called Valkyrie Company. Hearing this familiar name, Walker was immediately shocked, because it was a shop run by Roy, a businessman he had met in the woods and suspected of being the assassin. Elena candidly mentioned that the staff there were very friendly and even provided a warranty, so she felt completely at ease shopping there. Although Walker could hardly believe it, he told himself that Roy had no reason to target him, especially since he had saved him from the wolves. Then they arrived in front of the Valkyrie Company store, and upon seeing its enormous size, Walker realized he had been right. Roy's business was indeed thriving. Just as they were about to enter, a voice from behind called them back, and that person was none other than Roy, who had just arrived in his carriage. Walker was somewhat annoyed at the unexpected encounter with him. Roy, meanwhile, cheerfully explained that he had only stopped by to check on the store and, by chance, ran into them right outside. He seemed delighted to see Walker had decided to shop at his store. Surprised to see that the two knew each other, Elena asked Walker if Roy was his friend, to which he reluctantly replied, yes. Roy then turned to ask the young woman accompanying him who she was. Elena quickly introduced herself as a member of Walker's team. Hearing this, Roy looked intently at Elena for a moment. Then he leaned in and whispered to Walker that he had done very well, completely misunderstanding the situation. Not wanting to cause any further misunderstanding or trouble, Walker decided to quickly buy what he needed and leave. He told Elena that since Roy was there inspecting the shop, he must be very busy, so Elena should quickly buy what she needed. However, Roy quickly explained that he wasn't busy at all, and that entertaining his savior was the most important thing. Then he asked Walker what he intended to buy and offered to give him anything he needed. Hearing this, Walker immediately refused, because to him there was nothing more frightening than receiving something for free. He absolutely did not want to be indebted to Roy. Seeing Walker refuse, Roy turned to ask Elena what she wanted to buy. She said she had come to buy a bag, and Roy immediately offered to give it to her for free. Elena also hastily refused, but Roy insisted, saying that this was the least he could do to repay the life-saving favor. To him, giving 1 or 2 bags was nothing compared to owing someone a life. Having said that, Roy enthusiastically invited them into the shop. After entering, Walker couldn't hide his nervousness, constantly glancing around, while Elena eagerly admired the displayed items. Roy then began to explain that although the prices in their store were somewhat higher, their business philosophy of fair trade ensured that all products in the shop were of excellent quality. He added that his company had good relationships with artisans, so the best products were always sent directly to the store. At the same time, Roy also mentioned that recently many people have been using illegal slaves to manufacture counterfeit goods and then selling them, and expressed his outrage at such actions, asserting that he absolutely cannot forgive such people. Meanwhile, Walker paid little attention to what he said, his focus mostly on observing the store. He had initially imagined it to be a high-end establishment, but after looking around, he realized it resembled a large-scale retail store more than anything else. This also explained why Roy's business was thriving. Just then, Roy's assistant brought out a bag and showed it to Elena, asking if she was looking for this item. A storage bag. Upon seeing it, Elena was overjoyed. She confirmed that this was the bag she had been searching for because it had a snap closure, wouldn't tear even when packed with many items, and was reinforced with magic to hold 5 times the normal amount of things. Roy explained that these functions were specifically designed for adventurers and asked her to take them. Hesitantly, she asked if he was sure, and he assured her. Roy then asked Walker if there was anything he liked that he was willing to give him. But Walker quickly declined, saying he didn't need it, although he felt a little regretful. Roy understood that Walker didn't want to be indebted, but since this was a way of repaying him for saving his life, he still hoped Walker wouldn't mind. Walker replied that it was no big deal. Roy could certainly handle the wolves himself. He also said he was very grateful for the bag for Elena, but that he didn't really need anything for himself. Then he and Elena left, saying goodbye to Roy and wishing him a good day. Roy waved goodbye. Watching them disappear into the distance, he looked forward to the day Walker would return to his shop. Then he chuckled and revealed that the pack of wolves was actually something he had set up to test the strength of the mercenaries. He was impressed that Walker had realized that. Roy's assistant confirmed that the tracking charm attached to the bag was still working properly, and Roy praised her for doing a good job. Seeing how careful and gentle Elena seemed, he guessed she must be from the countryside, looking both innocent and lovely. Roy believed that someone like her would fetch a high price on the black market. Meanwhile, from the moment she left the store, Elena had been smiling constantly. Walker remarked that she seemed very happy. Elena replied that it was true because she felt she had finally become a real adventurer thanks to this bag. But putting that aside, she was surprised to learn that he knew the owner of the Valkyrie company. Impressed, she complimented him, saying he was truly a wonderful person. As Walker was hesitating, unsure how to respond, he suddenly sensed something and immediately turned around, looking confused. Elena asked what was wrong, and he replied that he definitely had the feeling of being followed, but then said it was probably just his imagination because the area was quite crowded. Elena agreed with him. However, it wasn't just his imagination, because he had actually sensed their presence through his level 2 danger detection skill, so it couldn't possibly be an illusion. Thinking back, he also found it very strange that Roy knew his name even without him ever introducing himself. When he started acting a little strangely, Elena worriedly asked if he was okay. He apologized and said he was just a little tired. Hearing this, Elena apologized for making him walk such a long distance despite his fatigue. She offered to walk the rest of the way herself since the inn was nearby, but Walker immediately refused, insisting on taking her all the way to the inn's door, and Elena agreed. Because he suspected that the people he sensed might be Roy's men, and that their target seemed to be him alone, he quickly decided he had to get Elena back to the inn as soon as possible and then leave her immediately. Later, when the two arrived at the inn's entrance, Elena thanked him, and Walker replied that it was nothing. She also mentioned that she would come to his inn at the same time the next day and advised him not to overexert himself if he felt tired. Walker assured her that he would remember that and that a day's rest would be enough. When he said goodbye, Elena waved both hands with a warm smile and said she would see him again later. Seeing this, Walker unconsciously waved back at her while Elena continued waving. After being reincarnated as a virus, he initially had very distorted plans due to the influence of his past life. But after today, he feels that if he can live peacefully each day like this with Elena, it would be wonderful. Therefore, he was determined to put her safety first, and at the same time planned to return to discreetly observe the Valkyrie company members to ensure they weren't doing anything suspicious. Elena watched Walker's figure disappear into the distance. She realized that the more she learned about him, the more unsure she became of whether she was worthy enough to be his companion. Moreover, he also seemed very secretive about himself, so there were certainly many things she didn't know about him. While she was lost in thought, a figure appeared behind her. She turned to enter the inn without noticing the mysterious man standing right in front of her, because she was still preoccupied with thoughts of Walker and kept her head down as she walked. She decided to put those thoughts aside for now and focus on training herself. At least that way she wouldn't become a burden to Walker. With her mind somewhat cleared, she headed towards the inn, only to be startled to find the mysterious man approaching. The next day, Walker felt extremely sleepy because he had stayed up all night watching Roy, who was essentially just checking the shop. Putting that aside, he was currently waiting for Elena, but she hadn't arrived yet, even though it was well past their scheduled time. He guessed she might have overslept, so he decided to stop by the inn later to check. After checking the inn and not finding her, he went to the Adventurers Guild and asked the receptionist if Elena had visited that day. The receptionist announced that she hadn't seen Elena either, meaning she probably hadn't arrived at the meeting yet. Feeling strange that Elena wasn't there, Walker suddenly heard loud laughter. It turned out to be Gajiru. He had just entered the assembly hall with his teammates, laughing loudly because he had just received a sum of money and planned to spend it lavishly. However, when Walker realized he was there and their eyes met, Gajiru immediately showed signs of embarrassment. Without hesitation, he turned and left the hall with his teammates. Witnessing that scene, Walker immediately became suspicious and quickly chased after them, surprising even the receptionist. Because they ran away the moment they saw him, and because they had harassed Elena before, Walker had a terrible feeling about this. Because they had vanished from sight before he could chase after them, he immediately activated the presence detection condition, causing a glowing thread to appear, guiding him in their direction. However, if he got too far away, he wouldn't be able to follow them anymore. Amidst the crowded throng, he followed the thread and arrived at an alley. Wondering if they had really turned in there, he stepped into the alley. Suddenly, someone unexpectedly lunged at him, attempting to stab him in the neck. Reacting instantly, he grabbed the attacker's hand, blocking the blade just in time. The attacker was Gajiru, who clearly intended to kill him, as the killing intent he emitted was far more intense than during their first encounter in the guild. Walker's suspicions were immediately confirmed. Without hesitation, he activated the electromagnetic release condition and struck Gajiru with lightning. Then he coldly stated that even if they tried to ambush and assassinate him, they would fail, because he had already cast a spell on all of them, and now, if they didn't honestly answer his questions, he would make them suffer terrible pain. Having said that, he threateningly asked them where Elena was. Gajiru nervously replied that he knew nothing, and that it had nothing to do with him. However, just by looking at his expression, Walker realized he was lying, so he immediately struck him with another lightning bolt, this time stronger and longer lasting. Unable to bear it any longer, Gajiru quickly begged him to stop using the strange magic, promising to tell him everything. He confessed that they had sold Elena into slavery. Hearing this, Walker fell silent for a moment. Gajiru then went on to explain that they had no other choice. If they didn't complete the assigned mission, they would all be killed. Walker then asked where the slaves were, but Gajiru laughed maniacally and refused to say anything more for fear of losing his life. Realizing that using electricity would take too long to extract information, Walker activated the Claw of Conditioning and Body Control, transforming his hand into a sharp claw that terrified Gajiru. He raised his transformed hand and warned Gajiru that if he didn't want to die instantly, before he could finish speaking, he swung his claws down right next to him, demanding that he reveal the whole truth. Terrified, Gajiru quickly confessed that the slaves were being held in an abandoned fortress to the north, while his accomplices stared in stunned disbelief at Walker's transformed arm. Gajiru added that all the slaves had been gathered there, asserting that this was all he knew and that he was absolutely not lying. Walker asked again if all they needed to do was go straight north, and when Gajiru nodded in confirmation, he transformed both of his feet into claws. Then, he used them as leverage to leap forward, jumping from the wall of one building to another, climbing higher and higher. Seeing that scene, Gajiru and his companions were completely stunned, realizing that the person they were up against was the real monster. Meanwhile, at the northern fortress where all the slaves were held, a group of armed soldiers were standing guard. Elena and the other girls, all handcuffed, looked around fearfully and bewildered, unsure of what was happening. Just then, a hooded man approached the soldier guarding them and asked if these were all the slaves they had bought. Hearing this, Elena quickly realized that she was facing slave traders. people she had only heard about in rumors, never imagining that she herself would one day fall into their hands. Despite being in danger, her thoughts drifted to Walker, worried that her disappearance without a word would get him into trouble. However, she reassured herself that a kind person like Walker would surely soon find new teammates. Dismissing those thoughts, she immediately surveyed her surroundings, counting a total of 6 people who had been captured, including a small child. Unexpectedly, the hooded man grabbed Elena's face, pulling it close to hers. His gaunt face and terrifying eyes sent a chill down Elena's spine. As Elena stared at him in horror, he remarked that she met their requirements. Despite her fear, Elena understood that the top priority was to find a way to escape with everyone else. Then, the hooded man released her and turned to ask their captor why there were fewer people than usual this time. The other man nervously explained that they had recently attracted the attention of a troublesome individual, Roy, the owner of Valkyrie Company. At that moment, Roy and his assistant were monitoring the entire situation from a higher vantage point using binoculars. The assistant confirmed that the 6 people below were indeed the girls who had recently gone missing in the city. Roy seemed pleased, noting that they had found the victims in time and that all were still alive and unharmed. He found it amusing that the slave traders' habit, kidnapping anyone they deemed valuable, had ultimately backfired. He explained that he had tracked them down thanks to a tracking spell his assistant had placed in Elena's bag. Then he told his assistant to rest assured because there were only about 20 enemies and no one had discovered him yet. Therefore, he believed that dealing with them would be quite easy. Worried, the assistant asked again if he really didn't need any assistance. He confidently replied that it wasn't necessary because assassination was his forte. As he spoke, shadowy hands emerged from the forest. These shadows were likely his ability. More hands emerged from his own shadow, and he declared that he would not only destroy them, but would wipe this place clean as if nothing had ever happened. Upon hearing this, the assistant replied that she understood the plan, but also reminded him that he had been working continuously for many days in a row lately. Therefore, she asked if he felt tired. Roy replied that at this moment he had no time to feel tired. If those girls were abducted by the black market traders, they would have to spend the rest of their lives being exploited in a foreign land. Seeing the little girl crying, he added that he believed that business deals and transactions should always be fair to all parties. Therefore, he could not tolerate those who used dirty tricks to unfairly profit from others. At that moment, one of the kidnappers grabbed the girl's hair and yelled at her to be quiet. He also complained that children always cry and don't fetch a good price. Seeing this, Elena immediately rushed forward, pushing the man away from the little girl. She loudly demanded to know how he could treat a child so cruelly. The man responded by punching Elena in the face, causing her to fall. Another man shouted at him not to damage the goods. However, the hooded man said it was fine. He believed that such a defiant attitude would make them too difficult to sell. With that, he pulled out a knife and pointed it directly at Elena, declaring that he would show her what happens to those who dare to resist. As Elena struggled against the hooded man, Roy was surprised. He had thought she was the timid type, but it turned out she was incredibly resilient. Since it was time to act, Roy calculated that from his current position, he could take down all of them without revealing his face. But at that moment, he sensed something and ordered his assistant to stop. The assistant looked confused and asked what was wrong. Roy replied that something was hurtling towards them from the forest at incredible speed. He sensed it was a very powerful monster. If they were to encounter it right now, things would become extremely complicated. And that monster was Walker, who sped straight from town to here. Suddenly, Walker landed among them, startling everyone and leaving them wondering who this person who had just jumped from the sky was. Walker immediately scanned the room for Elena, quickly spotting her with a bruised face and a knife held to her neck by the hooded man. When Elena recognized him and called his name, Walker immediately closed the distance, grabbed the man by the face, and shoved him away from Elena. He struggled to break free but couldn't, as Walker's grip was as hard as a rock, making him realize the man's incredible strength. However, seeing Walker's back completely exposed, he immediately decided to take advantage of the opportunity, using magic to create a crystal-like object behind him and stabbing it straight in, causing Elena to scream in panic and anxiety. However, Walker was completely unharmed. He calmly pulled the crystal out of his back, leaving the other man stunned. He stared in disbelief and yelled, asking why Walker was still standing when the attack should have been enough to kill him. Without bothering to answer, Walker pointed the crystal at him. Understanding what was about to happen, the man frantically begged for his life, but it was too late. Elena and the other girls watched in horror as Walker coldly ended his life, Elena trembling as she softly called out his name. While the traffickers were still stunned by what had just happened, they became even more bewildered when they saw Walker begin counting the number of people, concluding that there were a total of 20. Then he raised his claws towards them and coldly declared that he would kill them all, leaving no one alive. Overwhelmed by the sight and seeing Walker's hands and feet deformed into claws, one of them stammered in panic, not understanding what was wrong with his body. Walker then continued, adding that even if they all attacked him at once, they would never be able to defeat him. Disbelieving him, the traffickers yelled at him to shut up, and then all rushed forward, insisting that their superior numbers would surely lead to victory. In response, Walker pulled his arms back and swiftly swung his claws at the axe-wielding assailant, severing both of his arms in a flash. So fast, the assailant didn't even have time to react. Walker caught the falling axe and immediately swung it at the thugs behind him. Seeing that, some of the men were terrified and wondered if he was even human, while others scrambled to find a way to escape. Unfortunately, Walker noticed their attempt to escape, and having promised not to let any of them get away, he quickly leaped into the air to intercept them. Meanwhile, Roy and his assistant, observing the entire scene from a distance, were equally astonished. Witnessing Walker's ruthless slaughter of the traffickers was completely unexpected for Roy, because he had previously thought Walker was the gentle type. Roy never guessed that Walker had this side to him, especially after their first meeting in the woods. Afterwards, Roy became very curious about Walker and tried to investigate his past, but was shocked to discover that there was absolutely no information about him. This was particularly strange because with his connections, Roy could always find out at least a little bit about anyone. He found this truly unusual, as if the man named Walker had stepped straight out of the woods, as if he had been born there. As Walker prepared to finish off an enemy he had paralyzed with his infection, Elena burst into tears, calling his name and begging him to stop. Hearing her voice, Walker turned around and realized the girls with Elena were trembling with fear, while Elena, with tears in her eyes, told him that perhaps he had gone too far. At her words, Walker looked around and saw the countless corpses of the traffickers he had killed, along with the fact that he had nearly killed the last one. Realizing he had just lost control, he immediately dropped the axe and approached them, apologizing as he went and saying he would remove their handcuffs right away. Seeing him approach frightened the girls, but Elena quickly reassured them, saying he was her friend. Walker then began removing the handcuffs from each woman, breaking each lock. However, instead of thanking him, the girls quickly backed away, trembling and calling him a monster. This left Elena somewhat disappointed in them. Walker turned to apologize to Elena and then removed her handcuffs. As soon as she was free, Elena immediately rushed to embrace Walker, tears streaming down her face. She wept and apologized to him for causing him to do such cruel things, even though he was such a kind person. Walker, his voice trembling, asked her if she was afraid of him. Elena immediately shook her head resolutely, replying that she was absolutely not afraid. How could she be afraid of someone who had risked their life to protect her? Although Walker's face was hidden behind his helmet, he was undoubtedly feeling incredibly relieved at that moment, softly whispering, "Thank you, Elena." Elena continued to sob uncontrollably in his arms. Meanwhile, the last robber Walker had nearly killed but stopped because Elena intervened, immediately seized the opportunity and fled in panic. As he ran, he trembled, wondering what kind of monster it was, and decided to report Walker to their headquarters. But as he was running for his life, the shadow beneath his feet suddenly distorted, then pierced straight through his head, ending him instantly. The culprit was none other than Roy. He secretly observed that Walker wasn't a professional killer because if he were, he would have certainly killed all the robbers and disposed of all the bodies before leaving. Then, Roy ordered his assistant to ensure that the girls who escaped with the child were safe, and that they would not reveal anything about Walker. The assistant immediately obeyed, while Roy used his shadowy hands to lift the dead robber's body, devouring it into the darkness. Roy thought to himself, given Walker's complete lack of background information, his apparent emergence from the depths of the jungle, and his constant concealment of his entire body, Roy was certain that Walker was actually a hobgoblin in human form. However, after witnessing his actions firsthand today, Roy began to suspect that Walker was no ordinary hobgoblin. This suspicion stemmed from the fact that Walker seemed to be using some kind of magic that could affect the psychology of his opponents. Because Walker seemed quite wary of him, Roy even considered the possibility that he himself might have been unknowingly influenced. However, after watching Walker fight to protect Elena, Roy didn't feel that he was truly evil. Walker also didn't actively threaten anyone. Although Roy admitted he didn't know Walker's true intentions, he believed that if they could find common ground, Walker would become the strongest ally he'd ever had. And if that were the case, making Walker indebted to him in one or two ways would put Roy in an extremely advantageous position. For now, he put those plans aside. Roy focused on cleaning up the mess left by the slave traders, starting by disposing of the bodies. He used his shadowy hands to obliterate the corpses into the darkness, muttering complaints about the mess Walker had left behind. Roy estimated it would take a considerable amount of time to clean everything up. The following day, at the Adventurers Guild, while everyone was excitedly discussing the matter, a young man told his friend that someone had actually killed Boss Kajiru and his entire gang, leaving his friend utterly shocked and doubting whether it was true. The young man insisted it was true, explaining that they had been found dead in a narrow alley. Although this wasn't entirely unexpected, given that Kajiru was widely hated, but he was certain the culprit was the big guy who always accompanied Elena. Before he could say anything more, his friend interrupted in alarm and pointed behind him. It was Walker, the man they were talking about, quietly walking past. When Walker overheard the conversation, he was shocked to learn that the men were dead, as he remembered only threatening them a little. He never went further than what he had already done, but even though they were bad guys and he confronted them, the fact that he took so many lives afterward was something he himself couldn't understand why it happened. Putting that aside, judging by the fact that he received more stares than usual today, he guessed that the woman who ran away upon seeing him must have spread some kind of rumor, something like him being a monster or a murderer. Even though he had saved them, the violent scene he created made their wariness of him understandable. At that moment, the receptionist spotted Walker and called out his name with a radiant smile. He was surprised and flustered, returning her greeting. She asked him if the rumors were true, and he, confused, asked her which rumors she was referring to. She explained that she had heard he had single-handedly driven away an entire black market human trafficking gang, and moreover had rescued many women from being trafficked. Walker confirmed that while the story was somewhat exaggerated, the core elements were true. He believed he had done more than just scare them. Hearing this, the receptionist was very happy, because human trafficking was an extremely complex and difficult problem to solve, to the point that even the Adventurers Guild couldn't intervene too deeply. Therefore, she felt relieved to know that someone like him was coming to help. The adventurers around, overhearing the conversation, were astonished to learn that Walker had handled everything himself. Meanwhile, he himself was utterly bewildered, not understanding what was happening. As the women had witnessed his mutated arm and the horrific violence firsthand, making him certain that rumors of a monster's appearance would spread. However, it seems the most unpleasant details of that night were omitted before reaching the public. Just then, Elena unexpectedly appeared with a radiant smile, happily praising Walker as a truly wonderful person. Seeing her appear unexpectedly, Walker exclaimed in surprise, calling out her name, while Elena cheerfully greeted him good morning. He then asked if she was all right with her mobility, and Elena smiled reassuringly, saying that thanks to him, she hadn't been seriously injured and was feeling perfectly fine now, even ready to return to work. Then, he hesitantly asked her if she was really okay being on the same team as someone like him. Hearing this, she sighed softly and replied that she had said it countless times, that he had fought so hard for her freedom, so how could she possibly hate him? Elena's words deeply moved Walker. He realized that she possessed an extraordinary spirit, especially after such a terrifying night. Elena then remarked that his voice sounded clearer than usual today, and Walker replied that it was probably because his wound had healed somewhat. She was delighted to hear that and excitedly said that perhaps one day he could converse without a helmet, causing Walker to respond awkwardly and shyly. He revealed that the real reason his voice sounded clearer today was because he had used body adjustment techniques to gradually adapt to this new body. However, it was time for them to get equipped and register for their next assignment. Elena immediately asked the receptionist if there were any suitable assignments available today. The staff member proposed a Class E mission involving the extermination of a group of goblins. Although they hadn't caused any trouble yet, She believed it would be best to eliminate them early before they multiplied too much and became a real threat. Looking at the mission map, Walker was shocked to see that it was the very area where his goblin tribe once lived. Elena strongly volunteered for the mission to prevent a tragedy like the one that befell her village from happening again, while also expressing her intense hatred for goblins, creatures she could never forgive. Hearing Elena's words, Walker became extremely worried. He tried to avoid taking on the task by arguing that the goblins hadn't harmed anyone yet, so it couldn't be concluded that all goblins were evil. The receptionist agreed with this, but also pointed out that if the goblins started getting hungry, they might attack a human village. She also warned that they risk evolving into hobgoblins, which would cause even greater trouble. Unable to find any counter-arguments, Walker hastily pretended to clutch his back, feigning pain. Worried, Elena quickly asked if he was all right. He immediately apologized, saying that his wounds from the battle with the black market slave traders hadn't fully healed, which only increased Elena's worry. Walker then informed her that he might not be able to take on the mission today. Understanding his situation, she offered to take him back to the inn, but Walker quickly refused, saying it would be easier to go alone. Instead, he asked her not to take on any dangerous tasks on her own, and suggested that today they should only undertake a simple herb-gathering mission. As he said goodbye and left, Elena stood there, worriedly wondering if he was really all right.